threw the money at her face. Not handed it. Not placed it on the counter. Threw it a fistful of crumpled bills that scattered across the train platform, like he was tossing scraps to a stray dog. Edgar Caldwell, Red Hollow's most powerful man, straightened his coat lapels and looked at the young woman standing before him the way a man looks at something he stepped in. "Get back on the train," he said, loud enough for everyone on that platform to hear. "I don't know what kind of arrangement you think we had, but I will not be married to someone who can barely form a sentence in English." And those he gestured at the two bundled infants in her arms, with a flick of his wrist, his lip curling. "Those are not my problem." Nadia Volkov did not cry. Not yet. She stood there in the October wind, with Lena pressed against her left shoulder and Mira against her right, both babies too cold and too tired to do much more than whimper. Her suitcase sat on the platform boards behind her. One suitcase, everything she owned in the world. She had crossed an ocean for this man. Worked 2 years in a textile mill in Krakow just to save the passage money. Written careful letters with the help of a neighbor who spoke some English answering his advertisement in a Polish immigrant newspaper. Successful Kansas banker seeks hard-working wife for honest life on the frontier. All arrangements provided. No prior encumbrances necessary. No prior encumbrances necessary. She had read that phrase a dozen times and convinced herself it meant he was kind. The bills from Edgar's throw still fluttered across the platform. A few caught on the wind and sailed off the edge entirely. Nobody moved to pick them up. If you've ever been judged not for what you've done, but simply for who you are, if you've ever stood somewhere and realized that no matter what you say, they've already decided, then you already understand what Nadia felt in that moment. Not rage. Not quite. Something colder than that. Stay with me through this story. If it moves you, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. I put out stories like this every week, and I don't want you to miss a single one. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that platform. The morning Nadia had left Krakow, her aunt pressed a small tin of dried herbs into her hands and said something that didn't fully translate roughly. The ground is the same everywhere. Only the people above it change. Nadia had laughed at the time. She wasn't laughing now. She had turned 23 on the ship. Celebrated alone in the steerage hold. Nursing 2 babies who couldn't understand birthdays. Eating a piece of dried bread she'd saved from breakfast. Watching a candle some other immigrant woman had lit sway with the motion of the Atlantic. It hadn't felt like much of a celebration. She had told herself it would be worth it. Kansas. A man with money and a steady life. She had been so careful not to hope too much, which was its own kind of hope. Twins had been born 8 months earlier, in a charity ward in the port city of Gdańsk. Their father, a dock worker Nadia had trusted because he'd been kind for 3 consecutive months before he had not stayed. That was the plain truth of it, and Nadia had stopped dressing it in prettier language sometime around the 3rd week of a difficult labor, where she'd been largely alone. Lena had come first, small and outraged at the world, screaming before she was fully in it. Mira had taken longer, quieter from the start, watching everything with dark eyes that already seemed to be cataloging information. Nadia had held both of them and understood, with a clarity that left no room for self-pity, that her life had just become something very specific. It was about them now. Every decision, every risk, every letter written in careful broken English to a man advertising in a foreign newspaper. It was for them. Edgar Caldwell had looked at her twins and seen encumbrances. She looked at them and saw the only reason she'd made it this far. The train station at Red Hollow was not impressive. A single-story building with a wooden awning, a half-dozen benches, a clock that ran slow. Town itself was visible from the platform, a main street with a bank, a general store, a saloon, a church, a few dozen houses spreading out toward flat prairie in every direction. Sky above Kansas was enormous and indifferent, a pale October blue that offered no comfort whatsoever. There were maybe 15 people on the platform when Edgar made his scene. A few railroad workers, a woman with a market basket, 2 men in business coats who seemed to know Edgar well enough that they didn't look surprised. A young boy who'd been sweeping near the entrance and had stopped to stare. Nadia registered all of them without meaning to. It was a habit she'd developed without knowing it, always counting exits, always noting who was watching, always reading rooms because in the country she'd come from, reading a room wrong could cost you. Edgar waited. She understood he was waiting for her to gather the money from the platform boards, to stammer an apology, to ask him to reconsider. That was the script he'd written for this scene in his head. She didn't touch the money. She shifted Lena higher on her shoulder. Lena made a sound of protest. Mira had fallen asleep against Nadia's chest, which seemed, under the circumstances, almost insulting in its peacefulness. "I have the letters," Nadia said. Her English was heavily accented, her vowels shaped by Polish, her consonants not quite landing on the American side. But her voice was even. "You said." "I don't care what I said." Edgar's eyes moved to the watching townspeople, and something shifted in his expression, not embarrassment, but a kind of performance, the practiced ease of a man who understood that a crowd was an audience. The arrangement was for a wife, a companion, a woman who could represent this household in polite society. "What you are." He let the pause stretch just long enough to be cruel. "Is not what was advertised." One of the men in business coats made a sound that might have been a laugh, a suppress just barely. The woman with the market basket looked away. Nadia heard the boy near the entrance stop sweeping. "The babies were in my letter," she said. "The third one. You told me you had family responsibilities." He said the words in mocking imitation of her accent, just enough to make the shape of it wrong. That could mean anything. "I assumed a widowed mother, perhaps an elderly parent. I did not assume this." The wave of his hand encompassed her, the twins, the suitcase, the entire inconvenient reality of her existence. Lena chose that moment to start crying. Not a whimper, a real, full-throated, 6-month-old's announcement of displeasure, the kind of sound that cut through ambient noise and conversation, and general pretension with absolute democratic efficiency. Edgar flinched. Then his expression hardened. "There is a 2:30 train back to Topeka," he said. "Money." He nodded at the bills still scattered across the platform. "Covers 2 tickets. If you cannot manage that, I suggest you figure it out quickly. I have a business meeting at 3. He turned and walked away. That was it. No further scene. No moment of hesitation or doubt at the last second. He simply turned, nodded to the 2 men in business coats, and the 3 of them walked off the platform, as if Nadia had already ceased to exist. She stood there for what felt like a long time, but was probably less than 2 minutes. The railroad workers went back to what they were doing. The woman with the market basket moved toward the street exit without making eye contact. 2 men who'd been with Edgar were already gone. Only the boy with the broom was still watching. He was maybe 12, with sun-darkened skin and a serious face. He looked at Nadia, then at the money on the ground, then back at Nadia. "You gonna pick that up?" he asked. It was not unkind. Genuinely curious. "Yes," Nadia said. She put Lena down on the bench. Lena protested this loudly and shifted Mira to one arm and crouched to gather the bills with her free hand. Some had blown across the platform. She got most of them. Not all. She didn't count them in front of anyone. The boy watched her do this. When she straightened up and settled Lena again, he said, "The boarding house on Milner Street. Mrs. Okafor runs it." He seemed to search for the word. "She's not like him. She doesn't care about accents." Nadia looked at him. 2 blocks north," he said. "Turn left at the harness shop. Can't miss it. It's the one with the blue door." She nodded. "Thank you." He went back to sweeping. She picked up her suitcase, which was heavy, heavier than it looked, because she'd packed everything she owned that could possibly be useful, which meant it was densely packed and awkward, and she had to grip it at an angle to keep it from banging her knee, and she walked off the platform. She did not look back at the money she couldn't reach. Mrs. Okafor's boarding house had a blue door, as promised, though the paint was chipping along the bottom and the disc itself hung slightly crooked in the frame. The woman who answered Nadia's knock was in her 50s, substantial in the way that spoke of decades of physical work, with close-cropped graying hair and an apron that had flour on it. She looked at Nadia. She looked at the twins. She looked at the suitcase. "Get off the train?" she asked. "Yes." "You the one Edgar Caldwell just made a fool of himself over?" Nadia's jaw tightened. "You heard. Honey, by the time you walked 2 blocks, every person in this town heard, Mrs. Okafor leaned against the doorframe. "How much money you got?" Bold question. Direct in a way that felt, under the circumstances, almost like kindness, no pretense, no circling around to it. "Enough for maybe 2 weeks, Nadia said. "If I am careful." "You got references? Skills? Anything that makes you useful to someone who's not Edgar Caldwell?" "I speak Polish. Some Russian. I am learning English. I can sew, cook, handle animals. I am good with horses." She paused. "I had a position arranged as a household manager before in Krakow. Before I came here. Mrs. Okafor studied her for a moment longer. Then she stepped back from the doorway. Rooms upstairs. Small. You'll be sharing the floor with a seamstress and a telegraph operator. Bathroom at the end of the hall. I charge $3 a week, which includes one hot meal in the evening. Baby's included in that price, which I will tell you right now I'm not required to do. So we understand each other. We understand each other, Nadia said. She stepped inside. The room was small in the way that only frontier boarding houses could be small, not charming small, not cozy, but functionally small, with a single bed, a wash, a window overlooking the alley behind the harness shop, and approximately enough floor space to pace 4 steps in any direction before hitting a wall. There was a hook on the back of the door and a 3-drawer dresser with a wobbly bottom drawer. Nadia sat on the bed and placed Lena and Mira in the center of it, one on each side of her, and she looked around the room. She had been in worse places. The steerage hold of the Atlantic crossing was worse. Textile mill dormitory was worse. The hospital ward in Gdańsk, in the days just after the twins were born, with the smell of carbolic soap and old fear that was worse. This room had a window. That mattered. Lena was making exploratory sounds, grabbing at the blanket. Mira had woken up from her nap in a philosophical mood, blinking at the ceiling with that expression she had that always made Nadia feel she was being assessed. I know, Nadia said to them, in Polish. It's not what I promised you. Lena ignored this and grabbed Nadia's finger. But we are not on a boat, Nadia continued, and we are not outside, and the woman downstairs does not seem to be a bad person. These things count. Mira, who had been staring at the ceiling, turned her head and looked at Nadia with that dark, serious gaze. Don't look at me like that, Nadia said. I'm handling it. She spent the remainder of that first day doing the math that immigrants do, the relentless, humbling arithmetic of survival in an unfamiliar place. Counted the money 3 times. She assessed what she had in the suitcase and what she could realistically sell. She thought about what the boy at the train station had said about Mrs. Okafor not caring about accents, and what that suggested about who else in this town might be similarly practical. The problem was the twins. She had understood this before she left Poland, and she had chosen to come anyway, but understanding something in theory and facing it in practice were different things. Babies required constant tending. They couldn't be left. They couldn't be quieted on command. They cried when they were hungry, which was often, and when they were tired, which was also often, and sometimes, as near as Nadia could figure, simply because the world was strange and loud and confusing, which was entirely reasonable. Any employer who hired her would be hiring a woman who occasionally had to stop mid-task to feed an infant. Any employer who hired her would be looking at 2 small people and calculating the additional complications. Kansas, in 1876, was not a place that had developed sophisticated views on working mothers. Kansas in 1876 had fairly well-established views on women who arrived as mail-order brides and got thrown off train platforms in front of the entire town. She knew those views. She'd seen them on the faces at the station. Still, she had survived worse arithmetic than this. The next morning, she went looking for work. She tried the general store, first the proprietor, a stout man named Halverson, listened to her inquiry with progressive discomfort that curdled into a flat no before she finished her second sentence. He didn't explain. He didn't have to. She tried the hotel on Main Street, which had a sign in the window reading help, wanted housekeeping. The woman at the front desk took one look at the twins. In the carrier Nadia had rigged from a shawl, listened to approximately 8 words of Nadia's English, and said the position had already been filled. The sign stayed in the window as Nadia walked away. She tried the laundry, the seamstress's shop, the bakery at the end of the street. The seamstress was the most honest about it, a tired-looking woman named Greta who said, without quite meeting Nadia's eyes, that she couldn't have babies in the workroom. It was a question of liability. She hoped Nadia understood. Nadia understood. She tried 3 more places that afternoon. 2 didn't open their doors fully before declining. One, the owner of a small feed supply, actually seemed to consider it for a moment, asking her what languages she spoke and whether she could do sums. When she confirmed both, his expression shifted toward possibility. Then he asked where she was staying. When she told him, he asked who else lived at Mrs. Okafor's. When she said a seamstress and a telegraph operator, he nodded slowly, and then he said he'd have to think about it and she should come back Friday. She knew she would come back Friday, and he would not be there. That evening, she fed the twins and ate Mrs. Okafor's chicken stew at the long communal table in the kitchen, where the seamstress from upstairs, a round-faced young woman named Berta, made tentative conversation without directly acknowledging the events of the previous afternoon, which was considerate. The telegraph operator was a man in his 40s who read during dinner and didn't speak to anyone. Afterward, washing dishes because she could not afford to sit still, Nadia heard two women in the hallway talking in voices pitched low but not low enough. Something about that Polish woman. Something about at least have the sense not to bring children into a situation like that. She scrubbed the pot she was holding until the thought went somewhere she could lock it. 4 days passed. She went back to the feed supply on Friday. The owner was not there. His boy, maybe 16, told her his father had gone to Wichita for the week, which was either true or wasn't. She found 2 days of work helping a farmer's wife with canning hard, hot work that left her hands aching, paid 50 cents a day, and ended when the canning was done. She found 1 afternoon of work translating for a German farmhand who needed to communicate something complicated to his employer about the condition of some machinery. The employer paid her $1 for the hour and seemed pleasantly surprised that she existed. What she did not find was anything steady. Anything that could bridge a week or 3 weeks or a month into something resembling stability. The money counted down. The twins grew heavier. Not in a bad way, they were healthy, thriving, loud in the mornings, but a baby who weighed one thing in September weighed something different in October. And carrying 2 of them for hours, while walking from one rejection to the next, was its own particular exhaustion. She stopped telling herself it would get better. Not because she'd given up, she hadn't, but because the phrase "it will get better" had started to feel like something she said to keep from thinking too clearly, and she needed to think clearly. What were the actual resources? Who in this town had reason to give her a chance? What could she do that someone else in Red Hollow could not? She turned those questions over, while nursing the girls before dawn in the quiet of the small room, the window showing a black sky going gray at the edge. The wagon came out of nowhere. That was the way people described it afterward, though. Of course it came from somewhere. It came from the direction of the mill road, at the north end of Main Street, a fully loaded freight wagon that had somehow lost its driver. The horses' 2 big roans, the kind that had been worked hard and were not inclined toward patience, had taken some fright at something unseen, and were running flat out through the middle of town, iron-shod hooves loud as gunfire on the packed dirt street, the wagon fishtailing behind them. Nadia heard the sound first. She was coming out of the general store, where she'd just attempted and been declined, for the 3rd time that week, and she heard the hoofbeats before she saw what was making them, which gave her maybe 3 seconds of looking in the wrong direction before she figured out which way to turn. When she did turn, what she saw was this: the wagon coming hard down the center of the street, the horses wild-eyed and running blind with panic, and 20 yards ahead of them, outside the schoolhouse that sat on the corner of Main and 2nd, 5 or 6 children who'd come out for recess and had not yet processed that the sound they were hearing was coming toward them. People on the sidewalk were shouting. Some were running. One man made a move toward the street and then stepped back. The children were starting to understand the danger, but not moving quickly enough, or in the right direction. They were clustering together, which was the worst thing, right in the middle of the wagon's path. There was a woman near Nadia who had stopped walking and was standing with both hands over her mouth. Nadia turned to her. "Here," she said, and transferred Lena, the nearest baby, into the woman's arms, before the woman fully understood what was happening. She looked at the woman's face to confirm she had Lena securely, because if she didn't, this was going to go differently. The woman grabbed Lena instinctively. Mira was in the shawl carrier at Nadia's chest. She didn't have time to transfer Mira too. She ran into the street. Later, people would ask her what she was thinking, and the honest answer was, she wasn't. Or she was thinking, but not in words. It was more like a set of very rapid calculations that her body made without consulting her brain about whether this was a reasonable plan. The calculations went something like, the children won't move fast enough. The horses are panicked, not mean. Panicked horses respond to sound and stillness. If you can get in front of them and give them something predictable, they might stop. And if you put yourself in the center of the street, there's a better than even chance they'll split around you rather than run through you. That last part was optimistic. She knew that even in the moment. It was the kind of optimism that you needed to be able to function in a crisis, the kind that required you to bracket the parts that weren't certain and act on the parts that were. She got to the middle of the street. She was faster than she looked. People said afterward, fast for a woman carrying a baby, and she turned to face the horses. They were close. Closer than she'd expected them to be when she came off the sidewalk, and her stomach dropped hard at the sight of them. Two large animals that were all noise and velocity, and neither of them looking where they were going because they were past looking. They were just running. She did what her grandfather had taught her. She planted her feet. She squared her shoulders. She made herself as still and large as she could manage, with Mira pressed against her chest. And she spoke not a shout, not a scream, but a sound that her grandfather had shown her carried differently. A low, carrying, rhythmic sound in Polish that he'd said horses heard below the noise in their own heads. She said it once. She said it again. She kept her eyes on the animals rather than on the wagon that was coming behind them. The lead roan's ears went back, then forward. The horse's stride broke not much, but enough. 2 feet shorter between each footfall, which was the animal starting to think again rather than just run. Kept making the sound. The horses slowed. Not immediately. There was still 15 feet of terrifying momentum before they truly broke, and they came off to either side of her, rather than straight through, the wagon swinging wide behind them, and coming to a shuddering, creaking halt 6 feet from where she was standing. The children scattered. The street went quiet in that ringing way streets go quiet after something loud. Nadia was still standing in the middle of it. Mira, pressed against her chest through all of this, had not cried. She was looking around with wide, serious eyes, taking inventory. The man who owned the wagon was a rancher named Elias Mercer. He came from around the side of the building, where he'd been standing, talking to someone, when the horses bolted close enough to see everything, too far to do anything in time. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked, rather than the kind of thin that came from insufficient food, with a weathered face and hands that looked like they'd been through several serious seasons. He was probably 35 or so, though the frontier made it difficult to tell. The sun had a way of translating early 30s into something that read as older. Came to where Nadia was standing and looked at her. Then he looked at the horses, who had calmed completely, and were now standing with dropped heads and blown breath, looking spent and vaguely ashamed. Then he looked at the baby strapped to her chest. "You just stopped runaway horses," he said. "With a baby." "The baby was not involved in the decision," Nadia said. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to it. He looked at the children, who were being gathered by a teacher who'd come out of the schoolhouse, all accounted for. Then he looked back at Nadia. "You're the woman from the train station," he said. It wasn't a question. He didn't say it with any particular valence. Not the cruelty that had been in Edgar's voice, not the gossipy fascination she'd heard in others. Statement of recognition. "Yes," she said. "You speak to horses that way often?" "When they need it." He considered this. "My name's Elias Mercer. I run a ranch 3 miles east of town. I have 12 horses, a herd of cattle, and a woman who manages my household named Mei Lin, who has been asking me for an extra hand for the past 2 months." Nadia looked at him steadily. "I'm not offering you charity," he said, and his voice had a particular flatness to it, the kind that meant he'd said this before, to people who'd mistaken his pragmatism for something else. "I'm telling you I have a position that needs filling, and you just demonstrated skills relevant to filling it. Room is included, off the main house. You'd have it to yourself, which means your daughters would have it too." Lena, still in the arms of the woman on the sidewalk, made a sound of impatience. "Those are both yours?" Elias asked. "Twins?"
"Yes."
A pause.
"How old?"
6 months. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked at Nadia. "The room's big enough for a crib. We'd figure the rest out." Across the street, Edgar Caldwell had come out of his bank to see what the commotion was about. He was standing on his steps, watching. Nadia could feel his presence without fully looking at him, the way you feel weather coming from a direction you're not facing. She looked back at Elias Mercer. His expression was patient, waiting for an answer that he didn't seem to assume was already certain. She thought about the hotel with the help wanted sign that was already filled. She thought about the seamstress, who couldn't have babies in the workroom. She thought about the money she'd counted that morning, that had enough left for approximately 11 more days at the boarding house. "I can start tomorrow," she said. "Good," said Elias Mercer, and he went to retrieve his horses. She collected Lena from the sidewalk woman, who released the baby with a look on her face that Nadia had no energy to interpret. She gathered her suitcase, which she'd left near the store entrance. She walked back to Mrs. Okafor's with both babies and all her belongings, and the specific kind of exhaustion that came not from the body, but from the sustained effort of holding a shape under pressure for too long. At the blue door, she stopped. She thought about the letters she'd brought from Krakow, folded small in the inner pocket of her coat. Edgar's letters, with his careful typewritten words, and his assurances about the life they would build. She had planned to keep them, as evidence of what had been promised, as something she might need. She thought about the platform, and the bills scattered across the boards, and the way he'd looked at the twins. She went inside. She put the babies on the bed. She sat beside them in the small room, with the window that overlooked the alley, and she let herself, finally, be tired in a way she'd been not letting herself be for 4 days. Outside the window, the Kansas sky went the particular amber-orange of autumn prairie evenings, huge and indifferent, offering nothing but air. She would go to Elias Mercer's ranch in the morning. She did not know yet what it would ask of her. She did not know yet what it would give back. She only knew that she had not come all this way to disappear, and she had 2 very specific, very loud reasons why that mattered more than anything Edgar Caldwell or the entirety of Red Hollow could throw at her. Lena grabbed her finger. Mira studied the ceiling. Nadia closed her eyes, just for a moment, and breathed. Tomorrow she would begin again. That was what she did. That was what she had always done. The wagon that carried Nadia and the twins to Elias Mercer's ranch left Red Hollow before 7 in the morning, while the town was still in that gray, half-awake state where the only people out were the ones who had no choice about it. Elias had sent a hand named Cord to collect her a quiet young man of maybe 22 who loaded her suitcase without comment and held the wagon steady while she climbed up with both babies, and who drove the 3 miles east without attempting conversation, which she appreciated more than she could have experienced any language. The ranch came into view gradually. First the fence line, then the outbuildings, then the main house, a 2-story structure that had clearly been built in pieces over several years, each addition slightly different from the last, in a way that gave the whole thing a particular, unplanned character. It was not elegant. It was not what she'd imagined when she'd read Edgar's letters about Kansas prosperity. But there were horses in the paddock and smoke from the kitchen chimney, and a woman standing at the yard gate who watched the wagon approach, with an expression of careful assessment. Maylin was perhaps 40, though she carried herself in a way that made age seem beside the point. She was Chinese, with sharp dark eyes, and a practical economy of movement that Nadia recognized as the particular efficiency of someone who had learned to do a great deal with whatever was available. She looked at Nadia. She looked at the twins. She looked at the suitcase Cord was unloading. "He told me 1 baby," she said. 2, Nadia said. Maylin looked at her for another moment. Then she said, "The room is bigger than it looks from outside," and turned back toward the house. "Come in before the coffee gets cold." That was the entirety of their introduction. It was, Nadia would later think, about as good an introduction as she'd ever had. The room off the main house was, in fact, bigger than it looked, a converted storage space with a proper window, a wood-burning stove, and enough floor space that when Cord brought in a second crib from somewhere in the barn's upper storage, both cribs fit without forcing anyone to squeeze past anything. The walls needed paint. The floor had a draft near the east corner. The window faced the paddock, which meant the first sound every morning would be horses. Nadia stood in the room with a baby on each hip and looked at it. "Fine," she said, mostly to herself. "It's not fine," Maylin said from the doorway, with a frankness that was so startling until Nadia realized it wasn't criticism. "Stove smokes a little when the wind is from the north. The bottom of the second drawer on that dresser sticks. The latch on the window needs to be lifted at an angle or it won't hold." She paused. "Now you know. You won't be surprised by it." "Thank you," Nadia said. Maylin shrugged one shoulder. Surprises make everything harder. The first week at the ranch was a careful, watchful thing on both sides. Elias set her to work in the barn initially, not because there wasn't other work, but because, she understood, he wanted to see whether what he'd witnessed in the street was a one-time thing or something more consistent. She didn't resent this. It was sensible. He was trusting her with 12 animals and whatever else the ranch depended on, and trust was not something you extended at full volume on the first day. You extended it in increments, watching to see if the other person knew how to carry it. She learned the horses by name over the first 2 days. Not just by the names Elias used Cord. The hand who drove the wagon helped with this, but by temperament. by the particular tells each animal had when it was uncomfortable or willing or simply bored. The big gray mare named Cora had an ear she turned differently when she was about to bite. The younger gelding Jude moved his weight to his hindquarters before he kicked. The old buckskin Elias, called Temperance, was arthritic in the right shoulder and needed approaching from the left. She noted all of it without being asked to. She adjusted her approach with each animal accordingly. By the fourth day, Cord was watching her with something that wasn't quite respect, but was headed in that direction, which in a 22-year-old ranch hand was probably as close as you got. Maylin watched from a distance for those first days. Nadia felt it not hostility, more like the process of forming a judgment that wasn't going to be rushed by politeness. She understood this too. She was a stranger in a household that had established its own rhythms, and the person most affected by the disruption of those rhythms was the woman who ran the house. The test, when it came, was quiet. On the fifth morning, Mei Lin appeared at the barn door while Nadia was working and said, without preamble, "Lena had a temperature last night, not high, but I gave her willow bark tea, which she did not want. I wanted you to know." Nadia went still. "You were up with her? I heard her at 2. You were asleep." A pause. "You needed to be asleep." It took Nadia a moment to find the English for what she wanted to say, and by the time she had it, she realized she didn't need to say it at all, that whatever it was would be obvious in her face. So she just nodded. Mei Lin nodded back. "Then the willow bark works better if you add a little honey. I'll show you." That was that. Something shifted after that morning in a way neither of them named. Elias came to the barn on the 6th day, while Nadia was working through the cleaning of Temperance's problematic shoulder. Stood watching for a moment before she acknowledged him, not because she hadn't heard him come in, but because she was at a delicate point with the horse, and stopping abruptly would mean starting over. "The shoulder's been like that since spring," he said when she'd finished and stepped back. "She needs to be kept moving," Nadia said, not looking away from the horse. "Not worked hard. But if she stands too long, the joint stiffens worse. Short movement every morning." Doc Henley said rest. "Doc Henley, I think, knows people better than horses." She glanced at him. "But it's your horse." He looked at Temperance for a moment. Then he said, "Keep doing what you're doing. She seemed easier this morning than she has in weeks." He put his hands in his coat pockets. "You're settling in all right?" "Yes." "Mei Lin not giving you trouble?" "Mei Lin has been very good to me." He looked mildly surprised by this, which told her there was history she didn't have access to yet. "She doesn't usually warm to people quickly," he said. "She warmed to my daughters," Nadia said. The rest came from that. He considered this. Then, "I'll need you on fence work next week. Cord can show you the east pasture line. There's been cuts in the wire we haven't found the source of yet. It'll be cold." "I know what cold is," she said. He almost smiled. It was the same expression she'd seen in the street, not quite a smile, adjacent to it, like the idea of a smile filtered through a face that had gotten out of the habit. He turned and walked out. She went back to Temperance's shoulder. Cord who told her about Edgar. He didn't mean to. He was not the kind of young man who set out to tell you things. He was the kind who occasionally failed to not tell you things, which was different. They were working the fence line on the east pasture, the two of them, on a morning that had gone sharp and cold with a northwest wind, and Cord had been quiet for an hour before he said, without looking at her, "You know Caldwell and Mr. Mercer have history." Nadia kept working the wire. "No, there was a land dispute 3 years back. Caldwell tried to buy up parcels along the creek that run through the east edge of the property here. Mercer wouldn't sell. Caldwell pushed it to the county commissioner, claimed the water rights were improperly filed. Took the better part of a year to sort out, and it cost Mercer a lot of money and a lot of patience." He paused. "It didn't go Caldwell's way in the end. Mercer kept the creek." "I see," Nadia said. "Caldwell's not a man who forgets when something doesn't go his way." Cord paused again, which for him was a sign that he was deciding whether to continue. "Some people think the wire cuts aren't random." She looked up at that. The fence line stretched ahead of them, repaired in 3 places already this morning. "How long has the cutting been happening?" she asked. "Started about 2 weeks before you arrived." He seemed to hear how that sounded. "Not saying it's related, just timing." She turned it over. "Does Mr. Mercer know you think this?" "Mr. Mercer thinks it himself," Cord said with a flatness that told her Elias had already reached this conclusion and had not shared it with her because she was new and it wasn't her problem yet. "He just doesn't have proof of who's doing it." Nadia filed this away. She did not ask any more questions about it. because asking more questions would have told Cord something about how her mind was working, and she wasn't ready for anyone on this ranch to know that yet. She went back to the wire, and they worked in silence until noon. The townspeople's attitude toward her presence at the Mercer Ranch became apparent in stages. The way bad weather does, you don't always see the full storm at once, but there are signs in the air that tell you what's coming before it arrives. The first sign was at the feed store in Red Hollow, where she'd gone with Cord to collect a supply order. Clerk, a man she'd seen before, who had managed a particular kind of avoidance eye contact, the one other time she'd been inside, processed the order without issue until he got to the last item, a medicinal compound that Doc Henley had recommended for Temperance's shoulder joint. At that point, he said the item was out of stock. He said this while looking at a shelf that very clearly had 3 tins of the compound on it. Nadia looked at the shelf. She looked at the clerk. Cord beside her had gone very still in the way of someone controlling a response. "I see it there," Nadia said in her careful English, indicating the shelf. "That's reserved," the clerk said. "Pre-ordered." He did not specify by whom. She held the silence for a long beat. "Fine," she said, and turned and walked out. Cord caught up with her outside. "I can go back in my—" "Leave it." She kept walking. "There's another feed merchant at the edge of town. That one's more expensive." "I know." She stopped and looked at him. "Did Mr. Mercer tell you this might happen?" Cord's jaw worked. "He said there might be some friction." "Some friction." She filed that alongside what he'd told her about the wire cuts. The second feed merchant sold them the compound without comment. His prices were, in fact, higher, not unreasonably so. But the difference was there, and she was aware of what it meant. To use this merchant instead of the closer one on every future order would add up over months. It was a tax on Elias Mercer's ranch that hadn't existed before she arrived. She would need to think about this. She thought about it that evening while she helped Mei Lin in the kitchen. The twins installed in their corner situation, Lena in the portable crib they'd set up near the stove for warmth, Mira on a folded blanket on the floor, which Mira strongly preferred to any conventional sleeping arrangement. Mira had strong opinions about horizontal surfaces. This was a personality trait they were all learning to navigate. "How long has Mercer used the feed store on Main?" Nadia asked. Mei Lin was at the stove and didn't turn around. 12 years. "The same family all that time?" "Same clerk. The family's father died and the son took it over about 4 years ago." She paused. "The son is a friend of Caldwell's." "How much of the town is a friend of Caldwell's?" Now Mei Lin turned. She looked at Nadia with an expression that was doing a number of things at once. "Enough to matter," she said. "Not all of it. Not even most. The parts that control which businesses get credit, which shipments get prioritized, which families get invited to the right dinners." She turned back to the stove. "That's a particular kind of control. Doesn't need majority. Just needs to be in the right places." "How long has this been going on?" "The pressure on the ranch. The fence cutting started 3 weeks ago." Mei Lin's voice was even, but there was something in it, not anger exactly, more like the particular weariness of someone who had been patient with a situation for longer than patience was reasonable. "The supply issues started just after that. When word got around that you were here." She paused. "I don't say that to put the weight of it on you. I say it because you should know what is actually happening." Nadia was quiet for a moment. "Does it bother you that I'm here?" Mei Lin set down the spoon she was holding and turned fully around. She considered the question with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "No," she said finally. "But ask me again in 3 months, and we'll know more." Nadia nodded. That was honest. She could work with honest. The ranch settled into a rhythm that felt fragile the way early ice on a river feels fragile. There's weight it can bear, but you're always aware of what's below it. Nadia's days started before the light. Stove first in the room for the girls' warmth. Then the barn the horses needed morning attention regardless of weather or mood, or how many times Lena had been up in the night. She had learned that the hours before breakfast, when the ranch was quiet and her own thoughts were still organizing themselves, were the best hours for the animals. They were calmer. She was calmer. Whatever needed patient work, Temperance's shoulder, a thrush infection developing in the younger gelding's left fore, the general business of maintaining 12 horses through a Kansas autumn got better attention in those hours. Elias usually appeared in the barn around 6:30. He was not a man who announced himself. He was the kind of person who occupied space without broadcasting it, which took some getting used to. Twice in the first 2 weeks, she'd turned from a stall to find him standing there. and both times the startle had been genuine. He started consulting her without naming it as consulting. He'd mentioned something in passing: a horse that wasn't eating well, a pasture he was considering rotating, a problem with one of the water troughs, and she'd respond, and he'd listen. And sometimes he'd follow what she said, and sometimes he wouldn't. And either way, he didn't feel the need to explain his reasoning, which she actually respected. It was the difference between someone who consulted you because they wanted permission and someone who consulted you because they wanted information. Conversations were short. He didn't have the kind of personality that expanded to fill silence. Neither did she. This made working alongside him easier than it might have been. What she noticed over those weeks was that he was watching the twins. Not in a way that was difficult to interpret, not with the dismissal she'd seen in Edgar's face, not with the covert calculation of people who were deciding what the babies meant about her character. He watched them the way a man watches something he isn't sure what to do with, but is trying to figure out. Lena was easy to watch because Lena was almost always in motion, vocal, reaching for things, deeply interested in the world, and not shy about advertising this interest. Mira was harder to read, which seemed to be what drew his eye more often: that serious, watchful quality she'd had since the first hours of her life. One afternoon, Nadia came back from the paddock to find Elias standing in the kitchen doorway, Mira in his arms. He was holding her the way men hold babies when they're not sure they're doing it right, a little stiffly, with too much attention to logistics, and Mira was studying his face with that focused, cataloging expression she used on unfamiliar phenomena. Mei Lin, at the counter behind him, was making no effort to conceal her amusement. Nadia stopped in the doorway. She was making a sound, Elias said by way of explanation. He was looking at Mira rather than at Nadia. Mei Lin was outside. I didn't want her to... He seemed to realize the sentence wasn't going anywhere satisfying. She stopped crying when I picked her up. She does that, Nadia said. She likes to be carried. Right. He handed Mira back with the careful deliberateness of someone returning a borrowed object of value. Mira, being transferred, grabbed his finger with both hands in that absolute, unreasonable grip that babies have, and held on. Pause. She'll let go, Nadia said. He waited. Mira let go. He tucked his hand back against his side and walked out through the kitchen, past Mei Lin, who was still not quite managing to suppress her expression. Nadia looked at her. Say nothing, Nadia said. I didn't say anything. Mei Lin pleasantly, and went back to the counter. The gossip in town progressed in the way gossip does when it's being organized rather than simply spreading. There's organic gossip, which is chaotic and shifts and contradicts itself. And then there's the kind with a hand behind it, shaped toward a particular conclusion, with particular details emphasized and others left out. What circulated in Red Hollow's shops and church steps and dinner tables about Nadia Volkov had the second texture. She knew this because Mrs. Okafor told her bluntly during one of Nadia's visits to collect a few things she'd left behind. They're saying you went to Mercer's ranch because you knew he didn't have a wife, Mrs. Okafor said, handing her a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for but clearly needed. They're saying you're using those babies to make yourself seem sympathetic, so he'll feel obligated to her. To marry me, Nadia said flatly. They think I arranged all of this. Some of them think you arranged getting thrown off the platform, even, that it was a performance to get sympathy. Mrs. Okafor's expression made clear what she thought of this theory. Caldwell's been making the rounds. He told people at the bank he was protecting you by refusing the arrangement that he found out something troubling about your background and acted for the town's benefit. The specific thing Nadia felt in that moment was not rage, though rage was in there. It was something more surgical. She recognized what Edgar was doing. He was protecting his own status, rewriting the story of that platform, in a version where he was the sensible one and she was the problem. It was a coherent strategy, and the fact that it was a lie didn't make it less effective. Who believes him? She asked. The people who were always going to believe him, Mrs. Okafor said, and the people who are afraid of what happens if they don't. She refilled Nadia's coffee without asking. The rest of them are watching to see how things fall. Something then, Nadia said. It's not much. No. But it's something. The fire was what changed everything in the short term and set in motion everything that would come after. She smelled it before she heard it smoke. Not the ordinary wood smoke of the kitchen stove, but something with a different weight to it. An urgency in the smell that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to whatever part of a person knows danger without having to reason about it. She was in her room with the twins. The lamp turned low, Lena finally asleep after a difficult evening, and Mira in the particular limp, profound sleep that she fell into when she was truly exhausted. Nadia was out of the room before she'd fully thought through the sequence. The barn was on the west side of the house, and the fire had started at the back of it. She could see the light through the small window in the stall corridor. Not just glow, but active orange-red, kind of fire that had been going long enough to find purchase. She ran. The horses were already audible from inside, not their usual night sounds, but something higher and more desperate. The sound of animals who understand fire, the way humans understand drowning, with a physical, total terror. She hit the barn doors at a run and got them open. The fire was at the back 2 stalls hay storage, she realized, which was the worst possible location, because hay doesn't just burn. It burns with a particular ferocity that makes everything in its proximity burn faster. Smoke was already thick along the ceiling. The horses in the near stalls were throwing themselves against the gates. She didn't calculate. She went for the nearest gate. Cord appeared at the barn doors behind her. He slept in the bunkhouse and had seen the light. And then Elias, who had clearly come from the house at a run because he was in his undershirt in October temperatures and didn't appear to have noticed. Between the 3 of them, they got 8 horses out in time. They lost 2 stalls of hay storage and significant damage to the back corner of the barn, but they got the horses out, and the fire stopped spreading when it ran out of fuel. Nadia was the last one out. She had gone back in for the gelding Jude, who had gotten the gate catch between his teeth and couldn't figure out how to reverse the maneuver, and she'd had to work around the gate's position while the smoke got thicker, and Jude communicated his feelings about the situation with volume and motion. She'd gotten him out. She was coughing when she came through the barn doors, eyes streaming, one sleeve of her coat scorched at the wrist where she'd caught a running ember. Elias was in the yard. He looked at her, standing there with the horse, coughing into her sleeve. Then he looked at the barn. Then he said, very quietly, to himself as much as anyone, "That didn't start on its own." Cord beside him nodded once. He'd clearly already reached the same conclusion. The fire had started in the hay storage at the back corner, the part of the barn that was farthest from the house and farthest from the bunkhouse, which meant farthest from where anyone would quickly notice it. It had started in a location that gave it maximum time to build before anyone smelled it. That was not the pattern of an accidental fire. Accidental fires didn't pick the most effective starting point. Nadia wiped her eyes. She was thinking about Lena and Mira in the room, asleep. She was thinking about how close the room was to the barn, relative to the house. She was thinking about the fence cuts and the supply refusals, and Edgar Caldwell telling people at his bank that he'd been protecting the town. She was thinking about the fact that she had nowhere else to go, and that this was perhaps exactly what someone wanted her to understand. "We need to talk about what's being done to this ranch," she said. Elias looked at her. Not tonight, but soon. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the horses they'd gotten out were moving in the dark yard, unsettled, their breath clouding in the cold October air. Mei Lin appeared at the house door with a lantern, and both twins in her arms. She'd collected them when the smoke smell woke her, before anyone asked, and the sight of that, the twins bundled against Mei Lin in the lantern light. Mei Lin's expression steady and watchful added something to what Nadia was already carrying. "Tomorrow," Elias said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. She went to take the twins. They were both asleep. Even the fire hadn't fully woken Mira, who opened one eye when transferred, assessed the situation, and went back to sleep with the philosophical equanimity she applied to most disruptions. Nadia stood in the yard with her daughters, the barn smoldering behind her, and the horses restless in the dark, and the cold getting into the scorch mark on her sleeve where the ember had caught. She was not going to leave this place. Not because she had nowhere to go, though that was true. Not because she had made some dramatic promise to herself. On the train platform she hadn't. She didn't have time for that kind of promise. She was not going to leave, because somewhere in the past 3 weeks, between the horses and the dawn hours, and Mei Lin's careful, particular honesty, and the way Elias had held Mira with that awkward, effortful care, this place had become something she was building, rather than sheltering in, and she had learned, before she was old enough to have words for it, that you don't walk away from things you're building. You go back in the morning, and you pick up what was damaged, and you figure out what it needs now. She knew what this needed now. It needed the same thing the terrified horses in the street had needed. Not shouting, not surrender. Something steady, something that didn't break. She walked back toward the house with her daughters, and the lantern Mei Lin held, and she thought about tomorrow and what she was going to say to Elias Mercer, and what they were going to do about the man who had thrown money at her face on a train platform and not, apparently, finished what he'd started. She was not afraid. Or she was afraid, in the particular way that people who've survived difficult things are afraid with full knowledge of what fear costs, and a clear-eyed decision that paying that cost is worth what's on the other side of it. The wind was from the north, and it was cold, and the barn smelled of smoke and wet hay. She went inside. The conversation with Elias happened the next morning, at the kitchen table, before anyone else was up. Mei Lin had left coffee and gone to tend to the twins, which Nadia understood was not coincidence. Mei Lin had a way of creating space for necessary things to happen without making a production of it. Elias sat across from her with both hands around his cup and said, "Without preamble, I know it's Caldwell." "I know too," Nadia said. "Knowing and proving are different things in this county." Yes, she wrapped her hands around her own cup. The coffee was strong the way Mei Lin made it, strong enough that the first sip always required a small adjustment. "Tell me what you have. What you've seen, what you've documented, what you've kept." He looked at her. "You think I've been keeping records. Think you're not a careless man." A pause. He got up and went to the small desk in the corner of the kitchen, a piece of furniture she'd noticed but hadn't examined, covered in the organized accumulation of a working ranch, and he came back with a ledger and a folded paper. He set them on the table. The ledger had entries going back 8 months. Dates, incidents, approximate costs. The wire cuts 11 of them, all on the east pasture line, all in sections that would require the most time and material to repair. The supply refusals, 4 at the main feed store, 2 at the hardware merchant, 1 at the lumber yard. A note about a ranch hand named Peters who had quit without explanation 2 weeks prior, after 12 years on the property. A separate note about Peters being seen 2 days later at the Caldwell Bank, conducting what appeared to be a substantial personal transaction. The folded paper was a letter, unsigned, but written in a hand that had tried to be anonymous and not fully succeeded. The particular formation of the capital letters was distinctive in a way that suggested education and habit, kind of thing you learned young and never fully unlearned. She read it twice. The letter said, in careful language that stopped just short of being a direct threat, that Elias would be better served focusing on the west parcels and leaving the creek-adjacent land to those better positioned to manage it. That outside influences on the ranch's operations were unlikely to benefit its long-term standing in the community. That there were legal questions about the original creek water filing that might benefit from a second review by county authorities. "He sent this?" she said. It arrived with a shipment from the hardware merchant. No one admitted putting it with the delivery. "But you know." "I know." She set the letter down. She looked at the ledger, at the careful columns of dates and figures, the accumulated evidence of a campaign being waged in increments, small enough to maintain plausible deniability. This was how Edgar Caldwell operated, not in large visible actions that could be directly challenged, but in the slow pressure of a dozen small ones, each defensible on its own, collectively designed to make the cost of resistance outweigh the benefit. "He's going to escalate," she said. Elias's jaw tightened. "I know that too. The fire was escalation. Whatever comes next will be more." He was quiet for a moment. "What are you thinking?" She looked at him across the table. "I'm thinking we need allies before we need them, not after." The ranch hands who remained Cord and 2 others, an older man named Dix and a taciturn Swede named Lars, were told nothing explicit that morning. But they were not stupid men, and the burned barn corner and the new lock Elias put on the supply shed communicated what words might have overcomplicated. Cord, who already knew more than the others, worked with a particular focused grimness for the next several days that Nadia recognized as the expression of someone who has decided which side of a thing they're on. She began carefully to take inventory of what the ranch had in its favor. There was Judge Silas Reed, whom Elias mentioned in passing, a county judge, who had ruled against Caldwell in the water rights dispute 3 years prior, and who, by all accounts, was not a man who could be easily moved by social pressure. He lived 12 miles north of Red Hollow. Elias had not spoken to him since the dispute was settled. There was Doc Samuel Boone, the town's physician, who had treated Lena's brief fever and had, in the process of that visit, said enough about Edgar Caldwell in a 15-minute conversation to make clear he held no affection for the man. Boone was not a political person, he was a medical person, practical and direct, but he had standing in the community that existed independent of Caldwell's influence, because sickness did not check social allegiances before arriving. There was the community of immigrant workers and small farmers who existed at the edges of Red Hollow's social centralization, the German families in the northern parcels, the handful of Chinese workers who'd come with the railway construction and stayed, the Polish and Czech families scattered across the county who'd come for land and gotten it, but not exactly belonging. These were not people with obvious power. They were people with numbers, and with the particular kind of solidarity that comes from understanding, firsthand, what it costs to be on the wrong side of someone else's institutional influence. Nadia knew this community because she was part of it, had been from the moment she stepped off the train. She began visiting. Not in any organized way, not yet, but she had reasons to travel. The ranch needed things from the German families in the north, who had better seed stock for the kitchen garden. Chinese laborer named Wei, who worked for a neighboring farmer, had once worked with horses and had expressed interest in the Mercer stock. Small reasons that were also real reasons, because the work was real and the connections were real, and making them serve the ranch in ways that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with it simultaneously. She brought the twins, because you could not go anywhere without the twins, and also because there was nothing that opened a door quite like two 6-month-old babies who had strong opinions about the world. What she heard on those visits was consistent. Caldwell's name came up in almost every conversation, not always in direct relation to current events, but as a kind of background condition, the thing you worked around. The limit of what was possible, the name that appeared attached to credit decisions and supply arrangements, and the small consequential choices that determined whether a small farm or a modest business could sustain itself or couldn't. Nobody said he was doing anything illegal. They said he was doing what powerful men did, which was to make the cost of opposition high enough that most people decided the argument wasn't worth having. She listened to all of it. She filed all of it. She said very little. Elias noticed she was gone more than she'd been. He didn't say anything for the first week, which she'd counted on. He wasn't the kind of man who tracked movements and demanded accounting. But on a Wednesday afternoon, when she came back from the Hoffman family's farm to the north with a bundle of seed packets and a sleeping Mira and a very awake Lena, who had apparently charmed the entire Hoffman household, he was in the yard and he watched her drive the small wagon in without moving, with an expression that was doing more than one thing. Down. He took the reins, which she hadn't asked for but accepted. The Hoffmans, she said, for the spring garden. Mrs. Hoffman had surplus winter rye seed. She was going to let go to nothing. That's not why you went, he said. She didn't deny it. No, not entirely. He tied the reins. He turned. You want to tell me what you're building? Not yet. She took Lena from the wagon board where she'd been sitting. Lena immediately grabbed at Nadia's collar, which was her current favorite thing to grab, and she looked at Elias. Do you trust me? Question landed differently than she'd intended it, or possibly exactly as she'd intended it, and he was quiet with it for a moment, in a way that suggested he understood both the practical question and the larger one underneath it. Yes, he said. Not immediately, but not delayed in the way of someone trying to decide what answer was expected. Delayed in the way of someone who was being careful to mean it. Then give me 2 more weeks, she said, before we decide what to do about Caldwell. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once and went to finish whatever he'd been doing when she drove in. She let out a breath she'd been holding. The gossip about Nadia shifted in those weeks. It was subtle at first, the kind of shift that you only notice when you're paying attention to it, which she was. The specific story that Edgar had been circulating, that she'd maneuvered herself into the Mercer Ranch, that she was an opportunist using sympathy and 2 convenient babies to secure a wealthy man's household, was starting to develop friction against a different set of observable facts. The observable facts were these. She worked. Not in the modest, contained way that might have been expected and forgiven. She worked the barn before dawn, and the fence line in weather that kept the men indoors, and the vegetable garden that she'd started along the south side of the house, turning what had been a neglected strip of ground into something that was beginning, even in November, to show the geometry of genuine intention. She fixed things without being asked to fix them. She did not complain in public. She had, in the weeks since arriving, made enemies of nobody and quiet allies of several people, and she had done it without the kind of social performance that Red Hollow might have recognized and therefore distrusted. People talked. That was the thing about a small town. It was a precision instrument for observation, even when what was observed confounded the expected narrative. Not everyone revised their opinion. Plenty did not. But the confidence with which Edgar's version of events could be maintained was getting softer at the edges, and he would have known it, because he was not a careless man either. The response came on a Tuesday morning in early November. Nadia had taken the twins to Doc Boone's for a routine check. He'd wanted to see them at 2 months post-arrival, to assess how they were adjusting to the change in climate and diet. She was in the examination room when she heard Caldwell's voice in the front office, and the quality of the silence that followed his entrance. She did not move. She finished the examination. She dressed Mira, who objected, and then Lena, who also objected, and then she carried both of them into the front office. Edgar was standing near the door. He had a man with him, not one of his usual associates, someone she hadn't seen before, wearing a suit that looked out of place in a frontier town doctor's office. He was holding a document folder. Edgar looked at Nadia when she came in, and the expression on his face was something she hadn't seen there before, not the contemptuous ease of the platform, not the social performer's practiced disdain. Something tighter than that. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like the particular tension of a person who'd expected something to be over by now and was frustrated that it wasn't. "Mrs. Volkov," he said, using the name with a formality that was its own kind of insult. She was not Mrs. Anything had never been, and he knew it. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "I understand you've been making yourself comfortable out at the Mercer property." "I work there," she said. "Yes." The man with the folder was looking at her with an assessing professional interest that made her pay attention to him. "Not a business associate," she revised. "Something else." "This is Mr. Fitch," Edgar said with a small smile. "He's a representative of the Territorial Immigration Authority. He's been making routine visits to the county, verifying documentation." A pause. "I suggested he might wish to speak with you, given that your original arrangements in Red Hollow didn't quite materialize as intended." Doc Boone, behind his desk, had gone very still. Nadia could see him from her peripheral vision without looking directly at him. She looked at Fitch. "What documentation do you need?" Fitch opened the folder. "Your entry papers. Confirmation of your original sponsorship arrangement. Given that the arrangement appears to have dissolved, the Territory has an interest in confirming your current circumstances, and—" "She works for me," said a voice from the doorway. Elias was standing there. He had not been in town. She'd come with Doc Boone's assistant, who'd offered to drive her. She did not know how Elias had known to be here. He came into the office. He looked at Fitch. He looked at Edgar. He said nothing further, but his presence in the room reorganized it in a way that words might not have managed. "Mr. Mercer," Edgar said smoothly, "this is a routine documentation matter. I'm sure you understand the Territory has obligations." "I understand you paid a man to come and harass a woman who works on my property," Elias said. His voice was flat in the way that flat voices are sometimes more alarming than raised ones. "I understand you've been cutting my fences and leaning on my suppliers, and now you're trying to use government paper to do what you couldn't manage directly." He looked at Fitch. "Her paperwork is in order. She's employed. If you have legitimate questions, you can put them in writing to my lawyer, whose name I'll give you." Fitch's mouth had opened slightly. He was a bureaucratic man, and bureaucratic men are not generally prepared for the particular directness of someone who's out of patience. Edgar's jaw had gone tight. The performance had slipped just slightly, just at the edges, and what was underneath it was more honest than anything he'd shown her on the train platform. He was angry. Not the cold, contemptuous anger of a man who had no stakes in the outcome, but the hot, thwarted anger of a man who had been trying to make something happen and kept finding the mechanism jammed. "Be careful, Mercer," he said, and his voice had dropped. "You're making decisions you'll regret." "I've already made them," Elias said. "Get off the doctor's property." There was a moment, a hard, still one, and then Edgar Caldwell turned and walked out. Fitch followed, with the particular posture of a man who has realized he came to the wrong meeting. The office's door closed. Doc Boone exhaled audibly. He looked at Elias. "How did you know they were here?" "Cord saw Fitch arrive at the hotel yesterday and knew who he was." "Describe the man to me." He looked at Nadia. The twins were very quiet. Lena and Mira both seemed to understand, in the inexplicable way that babies sometimes did, that this was a moment for stillness. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "Good." He looked at Boone. "She's going to need copies of whatever you have on record for the girls. Medical documentation, dates of examination for the file." Boone nodded. He was already moving. Nadia looked at Elias across the small office. She wanted to ask how he'd gotten here, whether he'd ridden hard, Whether he'd eaten anything this morning, whether he'd known what he was walking into. She asked none of it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. Not unkindly. "Just means we need to move faster than I thought." Moving faster meant the conversation she'd been building toward happened that week rather than in 2 weeks. She put the twins to bed, and she and Elias and Mei Lin sat at the kitchen table, and she laid out what she'd been gathering on the visits north and south and east. She had names. She had stories. She had a German farmer who could testify that Caldwell's bank had called in a loan on a 30-day notice based on a contractual provision that had never been invoked before, not in 8 years of the same loan, not before the farmer refused to sell his east parcel to one of Caldwell's associates. She had a Czech widow who'd lost her supply credit at 2 stores in 1 week after she signed a petition against a Caldwell-backed development proposal at the county level. She had Wei, the Chinese worker, who had witnessed Caldwell's man passing money to the laborer she believed had set the fire, not proof, not the kind that would stand in court, but information that pointed toward it. And she had the letters. Edgar's letters to her, the ones she'd carried across an ocean and kept in the inner pocket of her coat when she left the boarding house. Not love letters. Edgar had never bothered with the pretense of those, but correspondence that contained promises, specific ones, about arrangements and conditions and what he was offering. Letters that contradicted, in detail, the story he'd been telling around town about the nature of what she'd presented to him. Mei Lin read them twice. Her face was very still while she read. Elias read them once, and when he set them down, he looked at Nadia with an expression that contained several things she didn't try to categorize. "These plus the ledger," she said. "Plus testimony from the people I've spoken to if they'll give it." "Will they?" "Elias, some of them. Not all. The ones who are most afraid of him won't." She paused. "We don't need all of them. We need enough to establish a pattern." "Reed," Elias said. "Judge Reed, yes, he already ruled against Caldwell once. He knows what he's dealing with. Getting to Reed means filing something. Filing something means Caldwell knows we're moving." Elias's finger traced the edge of the table. "He'll push harder before anything goes to hearing." "I know," Nadia said. Silence around the table. "Then we accept that," Mei Lin said. Both of them looked at her. She was looking at the letters, still laid out in front of her. "We accept that it gets worse before it gets better. We prepare for that rather than trying to avoid it." She looked up. "What we cannot do is wait until he makes the next move and respond to it. We are always behind when we do that." Nadia nodded. "The garden," she said, which seemed like a non sequitur until she continued. "Plot along the south wall. I want to expand it. I want to make it visible, something people coming down the main road can see from a distance. A working garden, productive, using methods from different places. I've been talking to Hirsch from the northern settlement about companion planting techniques they use that the Kansas farmers don't know yet. Wei knows water management from his province that would help the drier south sections." She paused. "I want this ranch to become something that other people have a stake in. Not charity. Shared interest." Elias was watching her. "You think that protects us? I think it makes us harder to isolate. Caldwell's strategy depends on making us a problem that's easier to dismiss than defend. If enough people have a reason to see this ranch continue, that becomes harder to sustain." Quiet for a moment. "That's a long game, yes." She met his eyes. "Do you have a shorter one that works?" He didn't answer that, which was its own answer. They talked for another hour about specifics, who would approach Reed and when, how to document the supply situation going forward, what to do about Peters, the hand who'd left under suspicious circumstances and might be a source of information if approached carefully. Cord would handle that, they decided. Peters trusted Cord in the way that men who worked side by side for years build a trust that doesn't fully dissolve just because circumstances shift. When they finished, Mei Lin gathered the letters and put them back in the order Nadia had organized them. "I'll make copies," she said, "in my hand so we have them. The originals stay hidden." "Where?" Nadia said. Mei Lin looked at her with an expression that said, plainly, "If I tell you that, they're not hidden." "Somewhere Caldwell's people won't look," she said, and that was the end of it. 3 days later, the ranch hands who remained got their first pressure applied directly. Came to Dix, who was the oldest of them, a quiet, weathered man in his late 50s who'd worked Kansas ranches for 30 years and had the disposition of someone who had seen most things and been surprised by fewer of them than you'd expect. Came back from town on an errand looking different than he'd left, a tightness around his eyes that he hadn't had in the morning. Cord noticed it. He came to Nadia, not to Elias. which told her something about how the hierarchy on the ranch had quietly reorganized itself in the weeks since the fire. Someone talked to Dix, Cord said, in the saloon. I don't know who Dix won't say. But they told him there was work at the Harmon Ranch east of town. Good pay, no complications. He paused. They said the Mercer Ranch was going to have legal troubles before spring. That anyone still working here by then would have trouble finding other positions in the county. Nadia absorbed this. Is Dix going to leave? I don't know. Cord's jaw worked. He's got a sister in Wichita he sends money to. If he can't work in this county, I understand, she thought for a moment. Ask him to come talk to me, not Mr. Mercer. Cord looked uncertain about this. He's more comfortable with. I know. Ask him anyway. Dix came to her that evening in the barn, where she was doing the last check on the horses. He stood with his hat, in his hands an old habit of deference that had nothing to do with gender, she'd noticed, and everything to do with how he'd been raised, and he looked at the floor before he looked at her. Cord says you wanted to talk, he said. Yes, she kept working as she talked not from disrespect, but because men like Dix were often more comfortable with conversations that had something else happening in them, something to look at besides each other's faces. Someone told you to leave. They said there might be trouble. There will be trouble, she said. I won't tell you otherwise. Caldwell is going to push harder before anything gets resolved, and he may make good on what he threatened about county employment. She glanced at him. Your sister in Wichita. You've been sending money since your brother-in-law's accident. He looked at her, startled. Cord must have mentioned it at some point. Yes, that matters. She moved to the next stall. I'm not going to ask you to stay if it puts that at risk. That's not a reasonable thing to ask a person. He was quiet. What I can tell you, she said, is what we're doing. So that if you decide to stay, you're deciding with real information, not just loyalty or stubbornness. She stopped and looked at him directly. We're filing with Judge Reed. We have documentation of the campaign against this ranch going back 8 months. We have testimony from 3 other families who've experienced Caldwell's methods. We're not fighting blind and we're not fighting with temper. A pause. Caldwell wins if people leave. That's his strategy, make the cost high enough that everyone around us decides it's not worth it, and then we're isolated and easier to break. She went back to the horse in front of her. It's a good strategy. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. Silence. If it works, Dix said slowly, the judge hearing might take months. I won't pretend otherwise either. More silence. She let him sit in it. The Hoffmans, he said finally. The family north, you've been up there? Yes. Old Henrik Hoffman. He had trouble with Caldwell's bank 2 years back. His son told me. I know, he's still here. Dix turned his hat in his hands once, twice. Henrik. Still farming. He is, she said. She let that sit, too. Put his hat back on. I'm going to head in, he said. Early start tomorrow if we're patching that fence section on the north line. The north line, she said. Yes, Cord said 7. 7's fine, he said and walked out. She didn't watch him go. She went back to the horses. She was not going to count on anything until the morning showed her what she had to count on. He was at the fence line at 7. Lars was beside him. Cord made 3. She looked at them from across the yard, and then she went to join them. What Elias said to her 2 weeks after the confrontation at Doc Boone's office surprised her less than it might have, if she was honest with herself, because she'd felt the conversation building for a while. In the barn in the mornings, in the kitchen in the evenings, in the particular quality of attention he paid to the things she said when she didn't know he was listening. They were in the paddock. He was working with the young gelding Jude, who was still unsteady under a rider and needed patient handling. She was watching from the fence rail, technically evaluating the horse's gait, actually doing what she often did in the paddock, which was think about 6 things simultaneously while looking at one. Stop the horse. He looked at her. I need to say something, he said, and I need you to just hear it and not. He seemed to not finish that sentence because he wasn't sure how it ended. She looked back at him. She waited. When I offered you work, he said it was honest. It was a practical decision. I don't want you to. Again, the unfinished sentence. I don't want you to think I had other intentions, that I wasn't being straight about. I didn't think that, she said. Good. He looked at Jude's ears, which were doing something non-committal. But he stopped again. He was a man to whom articulating this kind of thing clearly did not come naturally, which she'd understood for weeks. Something's changed. I don't know when. It didn't happen at once. He looked at her. I don't know what to do with it, and I'm not asking you to do anything with it. I'm just saying it, because I don't like not saying things that are true. She looked at him for a long moment. The paddock was quiet around them. Jude had lost interest in the conversation and was investigating a clump of dead grass near the gate. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not—" She chose her words carefully because her English was still a thing she built consciously rather than spoke instinctively. "I am not unaware of it. I haven't known what to do with it either." She paused. "We have other things to deal with first." "I know that. And I have 2 daughters." "I know that too." "You held Mira," she said, which was not what she'd planned to say but was what came out. He seemed briefly caught off guard by the specificity of it. She was crying. "You held her like she was something that mattered," Nadia said. "Not like she was an inconvenience you were tolerating." She looked at the fence rail. "That is not a small thing." In my experience, he was quiet for a long moment. "We deal with Caldwell first," she said again, "and then we see what's true." He nodded. Then he went back to the horse, and she went back to watching the horse's gait, and the paddock's quiet in a particular way. It was quiet when something has been said that changes the air without quite changing anything yet. She noted the time. She noted what she felt. She put it in the part of herself that she kept for things she wasn't ready to act on but wasn't willing to dismiss. Then she went inside to check on the twins, because Lena had been running a slight temperature since yesterday, and Mira had been making the quiet, focused sound she made when she was unhappy about something she couldn't articulate. And no matter what else was happening in the world, those 2 things were always the first thing. That was not going to change. She'd made that decision on a ship crossing the Atlantic, in the hold, in the dark, with 2 newborns, and a piece of dried bread, and a candle that swayed with the ocean. Some decisions once made stayed made. She went inside. The filing with Judge Reed happened on a Thursday in late November, when the first real cold of the season had moved in from the north and frozen the mud on the main road into a surface that was harder than it looked and uneven enough to turn an ankle if you weren't watching. Elias made the trip alone. Nadia had suggested accompanying him, and he'd considered it for a full day before saying, carefully, that Reed was a man who made decisions based on what he saw in front of him, and that what he needed to see in front of him right now was a straightforward property and contract dispute, not something he could complicate in his head with questions about household arrangements. It wasn't unkind the way he said it. It was practical in the specific way that frontier practicality sometimes required you to set down things that mattered in order to carry things that were more urgent. She understood. She didn't like it, which was different from not understanding it. He came back in the evening with snow on his coat and the particular quietness of a man who had done something that couldn't be undone and was living in the space between the doing and the consequence. He sat at the kitchen table while Mei Lin put food in front of him that he ate without appearing to taste. "Took it," he said. "Reed took the filing," Nadia said. "He took it. He read the summary in front of me. Didn't say much, but he read it carefully, the kind of reading where you can see someone actually thinking, not just looking." He paused. He asked about the letters. "What did you tell him?" "That we had original correspondence establishing the terms of an arrangement that was publicly repudiated in a way that caused material harm. That we had documentation of subsequent actions by the same party that appeared designed to prevent the affected individual from establishing alternative means of support." He looked at her. "I used the words the lawyer in Wichita gave me." Reed asked if the individual in question was available to testify if required. "What did you say?" I said yes. He held her gaze. "I hope that's right." "It's right," she said. From down the hall, Lena made a sound that was not quite a cry, more the particular sound she made in the early evening when she was tired but fighting it, which was a nightly negotiation that Nadia had learned to read the way a farmer reads weather. She excused herself and went to the room, and she sat on the edge of the crib and put her hand on Lena's back, and she thought about Reed sitting at his desk with the papers and reading them with the expression Elias described. The expression of someone actually thinking. It was enough to build on. It would have to be. Mira was already asleep. Mira, unlike her sister, rarely fought sleep. She simply looked at the ceiling for a while, with the focused attention she gave everything. And then she decided she was done and went unconscious with a completeness that Nadia sometimes envied. She stayed until Lena settled. Then she went back to the table, where Elias was still sitting with his cold coffee, and Mei Lin had found something to occupy herself with at the counter in the particular way she occupied herself when she was staying close to a conversation without inserting herself into it. "He'll notify Caldwell of the filing," Elias said. "Reed doesn't work differently for different people. Process is process." "I know. That means Caldwell knows by the end of the week." I know that too. He looked at her across the table. You said it gets worse before it gets better. It does. She wrapped her hands around her own cup. What's he going to do when he knows? Push, Elias said. As hard as he can, as fast as he can, before anything goes to hearing. He'll want to make the situation untenable enough that I withdraw the filing to make it stop. Will that work? His jaw set. No, then we hold, she said. And we don't do anything that gives him a different story to tell. The response from Edgar came faster than any of them had expected. Didn't come from Edgar directly, that was not his method. Came through the county commissioner's office, in the form of a notice delivered to the ranch, informing Elias that there would be an inspection of the property's water usage and creek access to ensure compliance with the county's updated resource ordinances. The notice was dated with a bureaucratic precision that told Nadia someone had prepared it in advance, waiting for the right moment to deploy it. The right moment, evidently, was the moment they filed with Reed. Came the Monday after Elias's trip north. By Tuesday, 2 more things had happened. Lars received a private offer of employment from a ranch across the county at wages substantially above what Elias could match, and a rumor began circulating in town. Cord heard it at the feed merchant. Nadia heard a version of it from Mrs. Okafor, who'd sent a note that Elias Mercer was facing financial difficulties, serious enough that he might need to liquidate the East pasture parcels. The rumor was false. It was also specific enough to suggest someone with knowledge of the ranch's financial structure, which was not general information. Peters, Nadia thought. The hand who'd left 2 months ago and been seen at Caldwell's bank. He'd worked the ranch for 12 years. He knew the property better than anyone outside of Elias and Mei Lin. She told Elias this. He was quiet about it, with the particular quietness of a man absorbing a specific kind of betrayal, not surprised. Exactly, but not armored against it either. Peters had taught Cord the basic horsework. Peters had been the one who knew where the secondary water line ran under the east pasture, without having to check the original survey drawings. He told them about the creek filing, Elias said. Probably the details of it, yes, whatever he knew. That's why the inspection notice is worded that way. It's too specific to be a general compliance check. She nodded. He stood at the paddock fence and looked at the east pasture for a long moment, and she let him look, because there was no shortcut through what he was processing. A man who'd worked your land for 12 years, who'd eaten at your table and known your horses by name, who'd apparently decided somewhere in the past months that his loyalty was purchasable. That was not a thing you moved through quickly. Lars, he said finally, is he going to take the offer? I don't know. I've spoken to him less than the others. She paused. He sent money home to Sweden until last year. His family came over in the spring, and they're farming a parcel north of the Hoffmans. If Caldwell makes things difficult in the county, he might feel he can't risk it. Elias exhaled. I know, he turned from the fence. I'm not going to tell him to stay. If his family's at risk... No, she agreed. You can't ask that. Lars was gone by the end of the week. He left without drama, which was somehow worse, just packed his things and shook Elias's hand in the yard and nodded at Nadia and Cord and walked to where his brother-in-law was waiting with a wagon. He didn't look back. Nadia watched him go from the barn door, and she noted the number of people remaining and did the familiar arithmetic of what was left versus what was needed and what it would cost to sustain. She'd been doing that arithmetic since she was 19 years old. She was by now reasonably fast at it. The county inspection happened on a Wednesday. 2 men arrived from the commissioner's office with survey equipment and a copy of the ordinance in a manner that was professionally neutral in a way that could have meant anything. They spent 4 hours on the east pasture and along the creek line. Elias walked with them, answering questions in the flat, careful way he had when he was managing his temper. Nadia stayed clear of it because her presence would complicate the picture, and she knew it. She spent those 4 hours in the barn and the garden, doing the work that needed doing, turning the situation over in her head. The inspection would find nothing actionable. She was reasonably confident of that. The creek water filing was legitimate. Reed had already examined it and found it sound 3 years ago, and nothing about the actual usage on the property had changed. What the inspection was designed to do was not find a violation. It was designed to establish that the question of the water rights was still open, still subject to official scrutiny, still something that could be revisited in a way that would complicate any hearing before Reed and give Caldwell additional legal leverage at the county level. She understood the shape of it, and understanding the shape of a thing she'd found was the first step to not being surprised by it. The inspectors left in the afternoon. One of them, the younger one, who had asked most of the technical questions and had the look of a man who was actually interested in land management rather than just executing an assignment, lingered near the paddock on his way out and looked at the horses with an attention that was personal rather than professional. "The gray," he said, to no one in particular. "She's got something in that shoulder." "Does," Nadia said from where she was nearby. "Arthritis. We've been managing it with movement." He looked at her, then at the horse. "My father had a mare with the same issue. He used a liniment from a German veterinarian. I can't remember the name of it. Probably camphor-based," she said. "We've been using something similar." He nodded. He seemed to realize then that he'd been talking to her for 30 seconds longer than his professional function required, and he adjusted his expression back to neutral and followed his colleague toward the road. She watched them go. She thought about the younger inspector's face when he looked at Cora the gray mare, the particular open expression of a person who forgot for a moment what they were supposed to be doing. She thought about the fact that he had come to this property on Edgar Caldwell's behalf, whether directly or through the commissioner's office, and had still paused to talk about horses. People were not always what the structure they were part of would suggest. That was worth remembering. It was also worth not trusting too much, because remembering it too strongly made you sloppy about risk. She went back inside. The document that arrived from Caldwell's lawyer in mid-December was the most direct thing he'd done yet, and therefore the most alarming, because it meant the oblique pressure wasn't working fast enough to satisfy him. It was addressed to Elias, but its content was about Nadia. It cited 3 specific claims: that Nadia had misrepresented her circumstances in the original correspondence with Edgar Caldwell, constituting a form of contractual fraud under territorial law, that her current residence and employment at the Mercer Ranch constituted an irregular arrangement that raised questions about her moral standing as a custodial parent, and that in light of these concerns, Mr. Caldwell intended to file a formal complaint with the territorial authority, requesting a review of the custody and welfare status of the 2 minor children in her care. Elias read it. His face went through several things in quick succession, and Nadia watched all of them. And the last one, the one that settled, was a controlled, cold anger that was, she suspected, more dangerous to Edgar Caldwell than anything louder would have been. He handed her the document. She read it. She set it down on the table. Her hands, she noted, were steady. She was not always sure where steadiness came from in moments like these, whether it was something she'd built or something she'd just been born with, or whether the distinction mattered. What she knew was that she could feel, underneath the steadiness, something that wanted very much to not be steady, a fear that had its teeth in the specific word custody, in the specific vision of someone official arriving at this house and looking at Lena and Mira with a form in their hand. She had crossed an ocean for those girls. She had calmed terrified horses in the middle of a street with one of them strapped to her chest. She had stood on a train platform while a man threw money at her face, and she had not broken. She was not going to break now. "He won't win that," she said. Her voice was even. "No," Elias said. "He won't. He knows he won't. This isn't about winning." "Making you afraid," Elias said. "Making me afraid enough to stop." She looked at the document. "Or making you afraid enough to ask me to stop, to withdraw from the filing to make this go away." He was looking at her steadily. "I'm not going to ask you that." "I know," she paused. "But I needed to hear it." Something shifted in his expression at that, just slightly, at the edges. Picked up the document and took it to the desk in the corner, where the ledger was, where the copies Mei Lin had made of Edgar's letters were. He added it to the file. That evening he sent a letter to the lawyer in Wichita. December settled over the ranch with the particular weight of a Kansas winter, not the dramatic snow of some years, but a dry, bitter cold that got into everything and required constant, tedious management. More hay, more water carried in buckets when the trough line froze, more attention to the animals' hooves and joints and general well-being. Twins, who had spent the autumn developing opinions about the world, entered December with accelerating specificity about those opinions. Lena had discovered that if she made a particular sound, she got picked up faster than other sounds, and she deployed this discovery with a strategic consistency that Nadia recognized as, technically, her own fault for responding predictably. Mira had started pulling herself to standing position against the crib rail, which she then seemed unsure what to do with, and would stand there examining the room with an expression of territorial satisfaction for minutes at a time, before sitting back down with great deliberateness. Mei Lin found this deeply amusing. She had, over the months, Developed a relationship with the twins that Nadia could not fully categorize, not quite grandmother, not quite something more casual than that, something specific to Mei Lin's particular manner, which was to engage with them as if they were sensible people who happened to be temporarily small. Talked to them directly, with no adjustment in her tone. She seemed to consider their responses, such as they were, with genuine interest. She had, at some point that Nadia couldn't pinpoint, become something Nadia hadn't expected to find in Kansas. She had become a person Nadia trusted without condition. That was not something she gave quickly or lightly, and she was aware of what it meant. It was Mei Lin who noticed, one December evening, that the Chinese laborers who'd been working on the rail extension south of town had not been paid in 6 weeks. She heard it from Wei, who had come to trade seeds for the spring planting, and had mentioned it the way people mention things they're trying not to worry about sideways. In passing, with a brevity that measured what it cost to say, 6 weeks without wages. The contractor who'd hired them citing delays in the railway company's disbursement. The workers camped in makeshift shelters south of town because they couldn't afford to move and had nowhere to go. Nadia listened to this and said nothing in the moment. That night she told Elias what she'd heard. He looked at her. There's nothing directly we can. He started. I know. But I need you to know I heard it. She paused. People at the bottom of the county's priorities are very often the clearest witnesses to what's happening at every level above them. If any of them saw anything related to the fire, or to the fence cutting, or to Caldwell's arrangements with Peterns, you want to talk to them. I want to talk to Wei first. He trusts me. He was quiet for a moment. All right. She talked to Wei the following week. She brought bread and a jar of Mei Lin's winter preserve, which Wei accepted without comment in the way practical people accept necessary things. They sat in the small, cold space where he was staying, and she asked him about the contractor situation, and he told her more than he'd told Mei Lin. The contractor had connections to the Caldwell Bank, the same bank that had handled the railway company's regional account, and the delay in payment had started at almost exactly the same time as the filing with Reed, which Wei said with a flatness that communicated he had already drawn the conclusion and was waiting to see if she had too. Caldwell has access to that account, Nadia said. He doesn't need access to the account, Wei said. He needs access to the man who controls disbursements. One conversation at dinner. One question about a loan extension, answered in the right direction. He paused. This is how it works. Not hands on the money. Hands on the person who has hands on the money. She understood this. She'd been watching Edgar Caldwell operate for 2 months. The fire at the Mercer Ranch, she said. Wei looked at her for a long moment. Can't testify in a county proceeding, he said. You know that. The court would dismiss anything I say before the sentence was finished. I know. That's not what I'm asking. He seemed to understand what she was asking. He was quiet for a while. Then he said there's a man named Dolan. He does work for Caldwell. Not the kind of work you hire from the labor pool. He didn't specify further. He didn't need to. Dolan was near the Mercer property on the night of the fire. I saw him on the road, coming back toward town, around the time you'd expect if he'd been there earlier. Did anyone else see him? I don't know. He paused. But I know someone who might know. There's a woman who runs the boarding house on the south edge of town, not Mrs. Okafor's, a smaller place. Dolan stayed there in November. She'd have a record of his comings and goings. She filed this. She thanked Wei. She gave him the second jar of preserve she'd brought without mentioning it, just set it by the door on her way out, and she walked back to the ranch in the cold with what she'd been given, and the understanding of what it would cost Wei to have given it. The railway explosion happened on a Friday afternoon, in the 3rd week of December, and it happened so fast and so completely that the first anyone in Red Hollow knew about it was the sound a concussive roll that people initially mistook for a distant thunderclap, though the sky was clear, and then the column of smoke rising from the construction site 4 miles south of town. Nadia was in the barn when she felt the pressure in the air more than heard it, stopped what she was doing. She stood still for a moment. Then she went to the house and found Mei Lin in the kitchen. Something happened south, she said. Construction site. Mei Lin had already turned toward the window. The railway extension. Yes. They looked at each other, the workers, Mei Lin said. Wei's camp. Nadia was already moving. Where's Elias? East pasture. Tell Cord. I'm going to get Doc Boone. You're going? Mei Lin stopped. She looked at the doorway of the room where the twins were sleeping, a 2-second look that contained everything. Then she looked back at Nadia. Go. I'll have them here when you get back. It was the only confirmation she needed. She took the fastest horse, Jude, who was still unsteady under a rider, but had the speed and was good enough now for an experienced hand, and she rode to Doc Boone's house on the north edge of town at a pace that got her there in minutes that felt longer than they were. Boone was already on his porch. He'd heard the sound and had, with the pragmatism of a man who'd spent 20 years responding to whatever frontier life produced, already assembled his field kit and was trying to decide on transport. "I have a horse," Nadia said. "Do you have a wagon?" "Borrowed from the livery," he said. "Boys hitching it now." "What do you know?" "Explosion at the South Railway site." "I don't know the scale. I know there are at least 40 workers in the camp near the site, mostly Chinese. Some others." He absorbed this. "Medical supplies for 40. What you have will have to be enough to start. Elias can bring more from the ranch." The wagon took 7 minutes. They drove south. What they found was not the worst it could have been. That was the first assessment Nadia made as they came over the rise and saw the site not the worst, which meant there was something to work with. Construction mistake had detonated a small charge prematurely, collapsing a section of the new rail beds and sending debris in a wide pattern across the work area. There were structures down. There was a fire, though it was burning in the material of the collapsed section rather than spreading outward. And there were injured men, maybe 20 visible from the road, some moving, some not. Boone was out of the wagon before it fully stopped. Nadia tied the horse and followed. The situation on the ground was what she'd expected, and worse in one specific way she hadn't. The injured workers, Chinese, most of them, with a few others from the general labor crew, were frightened in the acute way of people in pain who don't understand what's being said to them. 2 men from the town who'd come ahead of them were attempting to organize something, but the language barrier was producing a specific kind of chaos. People talking louder as if volume would solve comprehension, and the workers who could move, pulling away from hands they didn't trust. She moved to the nearest group. She did not think about the fact that she was doing this in front of the same people who'd watched Edgar Caldwell throw money at her on a train platform. She did not think about the gossip, the whispers about accents and respectability, and what kind of woman arrived at a frontier town with 2 babies and nowhere to go. She thought about what Mei Lin had taught her in the kitchen over 3 months of evenings, the words, "For I'm going to help you, you're safe. Where does it hurt?" in the limited but genuine Cantonese she'd managed to absorb. She thought about what her grandfather had told her about the voice that worked on frightened horses, not the volume but the steadiness, not the command, but the tone that said the person using it was not afraid. She crouched beside a man who was sitting against a piece of collapsed timber, his arm held at an angle that told her immediately it was broken. He was young, younger than she'd expected, maybe 19, and he was looking at the approaching figures with the specific withdrawal of someone who has been on the receiving end of hands that weren't helping. She said the words Mei Lin had taught her. She said them carefully, with the accent that wasn't right but was close enough to carry meaning. The young man looked at her. She said them again, and kept her hands visible, and kept her face where he could read it. He said something back, something she couldn't parse. Too fast, too full of specific vocabulary she didn't have. But he said it without pulling away from her, and he let her look at the arm. Boone appeared beside her. She explained the arm without moving away from the young man, and Boone took over the physical work while she stayed where the worker could see her face and kept talking not complicated language, just the small, steady words that meant here. Present, not a threat, and the young man breathed, which was what mattered right then. Over the next 2 hours, she moved through the site like that. Not healing, she was not a doctor, and she made no pretense of it, but functioning as the thing that happened before and alongside the medical work, the point of communication that made the medical work possible. She used the Cantonese she had. She used Polish with the 2 Czech laborers who were injured, who didn't speak Polish but recognized the sound family and relaxed marginally toward it. She used German with 2 others, her English. She used for Boone and for the townspeople who'd arrived and needed direction. She was not fluent in all of these things. She was functional in enough of them, under these specific conditions, to matter. Elias arrived with cord and a supply wagon 40 minutes in. He looked at the site, and then he found her in the middle of it, and he came to where she was, rather than going to where Boone was, which told her something about what he'd decided she was the center of in this situation. "What do you need?" he said. "More bandage cloth. Clean water the barrel on the supply wagon, start distributing." And someone needs to get the workers near the south end. Away from the fire section, they're not in immediate danger. But if that section shifts— Cord, he said over his shoulder. Cord was already moving. She went back to what she was doing. The young man with the broken arm, his name was Ren, she learned eventually, in the way you learn things in crisis by accumulating small pieces, asked her something in the third hour, when Boone had splinted the arm and the acute pain had become the duller, more manageable kind. She didn't understand all of it. She understood enough. He was asking where she'd learned the words. A friend, she said, in the limited Cantonese she had, taught me. He seemed to think about this. Then he said, in English that was careful and deliberate in the way of someone who had it but rarely used it, "You are not from here." "No," she said, "neither are you." He almost smiled. It was the particular almost smile of people who've been through something hard together and are starting to come back from it. Around them, the site was organizing itself from chaos into something workable. Boone was directing the more seriously injured toward the wagon for transport to town. Elias and Cord had the fire section cordoned off. The townspeople, who'd come a dozen or so by now, were doing the work of being told where to go, which people did reasonably well when there was someone clear about the telling. She looked up at one point and saw a group of them watching her. Not with the covert, slantwise attention she'd learned to expect from Red Hollow, the assessing, gossipy watching. This was different. This was the watching of people who were trying to reconcile what they'd heard about a person with what they were seeing her do, and finding the reconciliation difficult. She didn't perform for them. She went back to what needed doing. There was a man pinned under a section of collapsed framework who needed 3 people to lift it and a 4th to pull him clear. She was the 4th, small enough to get into the angle that the larger men couldn't manage, strong enough from months of barn work to hold the pull steady when it needed to be steady. The man who came out from under the framework was conscious and in significant pain and spoke a fast, frantic Chinese that she couldn't follow, but she held his hand while Boone assessed the leg, and she kept her face where he could read it, and she said the words she had until he ran out of energy for the fear and his breathing slowed. It was late afternoon before the site was stable enough that Boone declared the immediate crisis managed and began the business of transport and documentation. 12 men required transport to town for medical attention. 4 were serious enough that Boone wanted them at his office rather than returning to the camp. One, a man in his 30s with a chest injury from flying metal, was the one Boone was most worried about, and he said so plainly to Nadia when she was beside him, in the low, efficient way he communicated when he was working, and there wasn't space for anything else. He needs rest and clean conditions, and someone who can monitor his breathing through the night, Boone said, which is not what he'll get in that camp. She looked at the man. Then she looked at Elias, who had come up beside her. Elias said, before she said anything, "There's the room off the kitchen." She looked at him. "It's big enough," he said. Mei Lin doesn't need to be asked," she said. "No," he agreed. "She doesn't." They put the man, his name was Fong. The other workers told them in the supply wagon, with the most careful cushioning they could manage, and they brought him back to the ranch as the winter light failed, and the temperature dropped, and the smoke from the Southwood site faded into the distance behind them. Nadia rode beside the wagon. The cold was significant now. She was tired in a way that started in the bones rather than the muscles, the kind of tired that came from sustained attention under pressure, from running on the particular fuel that crisis provides, and then finding yourself at the other end of it with that fuel burned off, and nothing underneath except the real exhaustion. She thought about Lena and Mira, who would be fed and clean and philosophical about the day, in Mei Lin's care, waiting. She thought about the young workers' camp south of town, the men who hadn't been injured but had watched the afternoon happen, who would sleep tonight in inadequate shelter in December cold, unpaid for 6 weeks, having been reminded, comprehensively, that this country considered them a resource rather than a concern. She thought about Edgar Caldwell, who at this moment was probably at dinner in his warm house in Red Hollow, and who may or may not have already heard about the afternoon's events, and who would be calculating, in the way he calculated everything, what the afternoon meant for his position. She thought about what the younger county inspector had said about Cora's shoulder, and the way his face had opened when he talked about horses, and the fact that not everyone inside the structures that were working against her was working against her on purpose. She thought about the filing with Judge Reed, and what the doctor's careful documentation would show, and what Wei had told her about Dolan, and the boarding house keeper on the south edge of town, who might have a record of Dolan's movements on the night of the fire. She thought about all of it in the way she'd learned to think about multiple things, not consecutively, but in parallel, the way you listen for sounds in a barn, tracking several sources at once without losing any of them. The ranch came into view, light from the kitchen window. The faint sound, carried on the cold air, of Lena making her evening opinions known. She let out a breath. She was not done. She was nowhere near done. What had happened today was not resolution. It was not even close to resolution. But it had changed something, shifted some weight in the town's accounting of who she was and what she was worth to the place she'd landed in. Couldn't quantify it yet. She couldn't be sure it would hold. But she was still here. Fong was alive and would be monitored through the night. Ren's arm was set and splinted. 12 men who needed care were getting it. She dismounted and led Jude to the barn, and she did his care first before she went inside. Because the horse had worked hard and deserved the attention, and because that was the order of things on a working ranch, and she had been on this ranch long enough that the order of things had become her own. Then she went inside, and Mei Lin handed her a cup of something hot, and Lena grabbed her finger with both hands and held on. Fong survived the night. Boone came to the ranch at first light to check on him, arriving with snow on his boots and the particular efficiency of a man who had been up earlier than anyone had a right to expect. He did his assessment, while Mei Lin stood in the doorway of the room, off the kitchen with her arms folded, not crowding the process but not leaving either, which was Mei Lin's way of saying she'd been watching through the night and would continue watching until someone with a medical degree confirmed it was no longer necessary. Breathing steadier than it was last night, Boone said, when he came back to the kitchen table. He accepted the coffee Nadia set in front of him. The chest will take weeks to fully heal. He needs to stay still. He looked at Nadia. You're all right with him being here? He's here, she said. That's already decided. He nodded. He drank his coffee. Then he set down the cup and looked at her, with the expression of a man who has something to say that isn't strictly medical. What you did yesterday, he said, at the site. I want you to know I've been doing emergency medicine in this county for 20 years, and I've had trained assistants who managed less than you managed yesterday, without the language, and without any of the rest of it. She was quiet for a moment. I did what was in front of me. I know. That's the thing. He picked up his cup again. It's easy to do what's in front of you when what's in front of you isn't complicated. Yesterday was complicated. He didn't say anything else about it. He didn't need to. He finished his coffee, checked on Fong once more, and left with the same efficiency he'd arrived with, leaving Nadia at the kitchen table with what he said to end the particular, unsteady feeling of being seen clearly by someone whose opinion of you had previously been uncertain. She didn't stay with that feeling long. There was too much else to do. The town's response to the previous day was something she watched assemble itself over the following week. The way you watch weather form, you could see the components before you could see the whole pattern. Mrs. Okafor arrived at the ranch 2 days after the explosion with a basket of food and no particular explanation for the timing, which was explanation enough. She stayed for an hour. She sat at the kitchen table with Lena in her substantial lap. Lena had an instinct for authority figures and responded to them with flattery that was probably involuntary. And she told Nadia what she'd heard. People are talking differently, Mrs. Okafor said. Not everyone. Don't mistake me. Some of them have decided you're even more of a problem than they thought, because now you've been useful in public, which is threatening when you've already decided not to like someone. She paused. Some of the others. The ones who were watching to see how things fell, I think some of them have started to understand that what they're being told about you and what you actually are don't match up. Does it matter? Nadia said. Not bitterly practically. What they think. It matters to read, Mrs. Okafor said. Judges are still men. They live in communities. What a community thinks about a situation doesn't determine how a judge rules, but it shapes what's politically possible, what's survivable. She shifted Lena to her other knee. Caldwell's influence works when there's social consensus supporting it. When that consensus starts to crack, he loses leverage, Nadia said. Not all of it, but some. She thought about this for the rest of that day, working it alongside everything else she was holding. The crack in the consensus arrived in a form nobody had predicted. Peters came to the ranch. He came on a Tuesday morning on foot, which told her something about the state of his circumstances before she saw his face, which told her the rest. He was a man who'd spent 12 years on this land and had left it for reasons she'd theorized about but never known, And now he was standing at the yard gate with his hat in his hands, in the way Dick stood with his hat, that old frontier habit of a man who needs something and knows it. Cord saw him first. He came to find Nadia rather than Elias, which was becoming a pattern she'd noted without commenting on. She went to the gate. Peters looked at her. He was older than she'd imagined from the descriptions, mid-50s, with a face that had spent its whole life outdoors and looked like it. "I know you don't have reason to hear me," he said. "You're here," she said. "So talk." He talked. It took a while, and it wasn't organized. It came out in the way of a man who has been rehearsing something and finds, in the actual moment, that the rehearsed version doesn't fit the real situation. The shape of what he said was this. Caldwell had approached him last summer, before Nadia arrived, before any of the current situation. He'd approached him about the water filing, wanted Peters to sign an affidavit saying the creek access had been established by questionable means. Peters had declined. Caldwell had then offered him money not for the affidavit, but for information details about the ranch, the finances, the property boundaries, the waterline locations. Things a 12-year hand would know. Peters had taken it, and he'd been taking it, and he'd told himself it was just information, and not the same as actually harming the ranch, and he'd known while he told himself this, that it was not true. "Dolan," Nadia said when he paused. Peters looked at her sharply. "He was seen near the ranch on the night of the fire," she said. "Did you tell Caldwell when the barn would be unoccupied?" A long silence. "I didn't know what he'd do with it," Peters said. "That's not the same as no." He looked at the ground. "No," he said. "It's not." She studied him for a moment, the particular diminished quality of a person who has been carrying something they can't put down and can't carry any further. She thought about 12 years on this ranch, the horses he'd known, the seasons he'd worked, and whatever calculations he'd made that had led him to Caldwell's bank and then to standing here at this gate. "Why are you here?" she said. "Because Caldwell's dropped me." He said it flatly, without self-pity, which she respected. "I'm not useful to him anymore. Whatever he needed from me, he's gotten. And now there's no wages and no position at his bank, and no—" He stopped. "I heard about the South site, about what you did there." He looked at her. "I heard about the young man you brought back here." She waited. "Caldwell left those workers unpaid liberally," Peters said. "I don't have paper on it. But I was in the room when he talked to the disbursement man from the railway company. He made it clear the workers would be left in difficulty as long as it served his purposes. He talked about it the same way he'd talk about." He shook his head, like they weren't people he needed to consider. She thought about Way, sitting in his cold shelter, telling her about hands on the person who had hands on the money. "Will you say that to a judge?" she asked. "I won't lie under oath," Peters said. "I know what I did and I know what I saw. If a judge asks me, I'll answer what's true." He paused. "I'm not doing this for you. I want you to know that. I'm doing it because—" He seemed to not have a clean end for that sentence. "I spent 12 years on this land. It matters to me what happens to it." She could have said several things to that. She said, "Come inside. Cold and we have coffee." He looked at her for a moment. Then he followed her in. She wrote everything Peters said in the ledger that afternoon, in her careful English, with dates and names where he'd supplied them, and then she sat with Elias while he read it, and watched his face move through things she didn't try to name for him. "He knew about the fire," Elias said when he finished. "He says he didn't know what the information would be used for. I believe him that he didn't intend. But he knew Dolan. He knew the kind of work Dolan did." "Yes." Elias set the ledger down. He was quiet for a long moment with his hands flat on the table, the posture of a man working through something that has more dimensions than are comfortable. "What do you want to do with it?" he said, finally. "Send it to the Wichita lawyer tonight," she said. "Add it to what Reed has." And then she paused. "Peters is willing to testify. What he saw in that room, Caldwell's conversation with the disbursement man, that's not about our filing, exactly. But it speaks to a pattern. It speaks to the kind of man who's been claiming he refused me out of concern for the town's well-being." Elias looked at her. "You're not just filing a property case." "No," she said. "I never was." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I'll write to the lawyer tonight." The hearing before Judge Reed was set for the second week of January. It was, by the standards of territorial legal proceedings, fast which told Nadia that Reed had read what he'd been given and made decisions about its weight. The hearing would address the original filing, the property and contract dispute, Caldwell's documented campaign of harassment, the evidence of organized pressure on the ranch's operations. Peters's testimony had been incorporated into the supplemental filing the Wichita lawyer submitted in late December. Caldwell appeared at the hearing with 2 lawyers and the bearing of a man who expected the room to organize itself around his comfort. He looked at Nadia when she entered, and his expression was the tightest she'd seen it, the expression of a man who has tried several approaches and found each one blocked, and who has not yet decided whether this means he should try harder or reassess his position entirely. She looked back at him without expression and sat down. Reed was a compact man in his 60s with white hair and a manner of absolute procedural seriousness that left no room for performance. He'd been on the county bench for 18 years. He had, Elias had told her, a reputation for rulings that occasionally surprised both sides, which was the best thing you could say about a judge, that he was not predictable in a way that served anyone's assumptions. The hearing lasted 2 days. On the first day, Elias presented the ledger and the documented evidence of the campaign against the ranch. On the second, Nadia testified. She did it in English carefully, with the accent she'd been told on a train platform made her unworthy of consideration. She described the correspondence with Edgar Caldwell, the terms she'd understood to be agreed, the public repudiation on the platform, and the subsequent events. She was precise about dates. She was precise about what she'd witnessed and careful about the line between what she'd witnessed and what she'd concluded. Caldwell's lawyer cross-examined her with the specific technique of making the person being questioned feel they're being unreasonable, asking her to justify her interpretation of words, her understanding of arrangements, the assumption that she'd been misled rather than simply mistaken. She answered each question exactly as asked. She did not expand. She did not get angry. She did not give them anything beyond what the question required. At one point, the lawyer asked whether she found it plausible that a woman of her background and circumstances might have misunderstood the nature of the arrangement she was entering into. She said, "What I find implausible is that a man who wrote 7 letters over 4 months detailing the household, the terms, and the welcome he was prepared to offer could then claim surprise at my arrival. If there was misunderstanding, the letters make clear which party had more information than they disclosed." Reed made a note. Peters testified on the second afternoon. He was not a compelling witness in the theatrical sense. He was a plain-spoken man who said what he knew in the order he knew it and answered questions directly without embellishment. That plainness was, in the end, more credible than performance would have been. When he described the conversation he'd witnessed between Caldwell and the railway disbursement manager, the courtroom was very quiet. Caldwell's expression across the room was doing something it had not done in any of the interactions Nadia had seen. It was uncertain. Not defeated, not yet, but uncertain in the way of a man who has built a structure and is hearing sounds from inside it he didn't expect. Reed issued his ruling 4 days after the hearing closed. The ruling was long, 14 pages, that the Wichita lawyer summarized for them at the kitchen table. The 5 of them arranged around it, Nadia, Elias, Maylin, Cord, and Mrs. Okafor, who had appeared that morning as if she'd somehow known and hadn't been willing to wait for a message. The summary was this. Reed found in favor of the Mercer Ranch on all primary counts. The documented campaign of harassment was ruled an unlawful interference with property and livelihood. The original correspondence between Caldwell and Nadia was found to constitute an arrangement whose public repudiation had caused material harm, and the subsequent conduct toward both the ranch and Nadia specifically was found to have compounded that harm deliberately. Caldwell was ordered to pay restitution, a sum that made Cord's eyebrows rise when the lawyer named it, and was placed under a formal injunction regarding any further interference with the ranch's operations, suppliers, or personnel. Regarding Peters's testimony about the railway workers' wages, Reed noted that the matter fell outside the immediate scope of the hearing, but had been referred to the Territorial Authority for separate investigation. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, considerably more than nothing. Regarding the custody threat that had arrived in December, the document implying questions about Nadia's fitness as a parent, Reed had addressed it in a single paragraph of the ruling that the lawyer read aloud with particular precision. The claim was found to be without factual basis and was dismissed with a notation that its filing appeared designed to cause distress rather than address any legitimate legal concern. The kitchen was quiet when he finished reading. Lena broke the silence by grabbing the edge of the table with both hands and announcing something in the enthusiastic multi-syllable language she'd been developing for the past several weeks that contained clear opinions but no decipherable words. Everyone looked at her. Mira, beside her in the portable crib, looked at her sister with an expression that might have been agreement. Mrs. Okafor laughed first. It was a real laugh, full, unself-conscious, and then Cord was laughing too. And even Mei Lin made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was related to one. Elias looked at the table for a moment. And then he looked up, and his face had the expression she'd been watching form for months, the one that had started as almost a smile and had been gradually allowing itself to become the actual thing. She looked at him across the table. He looked back. Edgar Caldwell left Red Hollow in February. He did not announce it as leaving. He announced it as a business opportunity in Topeka that required his extended attention, and he said this to the people who asked in a way that suggested he expected them to believe it, which some of them did and some did not. The bank was sold to a partnership of 3 investors, one of whom was from the Wichita lawyers' circle of associates, and 2 of whom were, as far as anyone could tell, straightforwardly interested in running a functional bank rather than an instrument of social control. It was a modest improvement. Dolan was never formally charged in connection with the barn fire. The evidence that placed him near the property that night was witnessed testimony from a man the court would not have received favorably, and without Peters's more direct knowledge, which was, honestly, limited. There was not enough for a prosecution. Nadia understood this. She filed it in the category of things that were true and unresolvable, and that she would carry without letting them metastasize into something that poisoned what was actually good. That was a discipline, not a feeling. Some things you decide to put down not because you're done with them, but because carrying them serves no one. The garden in the spring was the thing she was most proud of, which surprised her because she had been proud of harder things. It had started as a strip of neglected ground along the south wall of the house. By March, it was a plan on paper, a working agricultural project, not decorative, using the companion planting methods Hirsch from the northern settlement had shared, the water management approach Way had described, and her own knowledge from her aunt's garden in Poland that she hadn't thought about in years until she found herself with dirt under her fingers and soil that needed to be understood. The garden was not going to save anyone. It was not going to resolve a land dispute or protect against predatory banking. But it was going to feed people and demonstrate something not loudly, not as a point, just by existing and producing in ways that the Kansas farmers who stopped to look at it hadn't seen used together before. Henrik Hoffman, old enough to be her grandfather, stood at the fence of the south garden in April and looked at the planted sections for a long while without speaking. Then he said, in the German-accented English he'd been using for 30 years, without ever quite losing the shape of the original language underneath it, "My wife would want to talk to you." "Tell her to come," Nadia said. Mrs. Hoffman came the following week, and she brought her daughter-in-law, and the conversation they had in the garden that afternoon was the first of a series that became, by summer, a regular exchange of knowledge between the Mercer Ranch and 4 farming families north and east of town. No formal organization. No name for the thing. Just people with different knowledge talking to each other about the land they were all trying to work. Way's wages arrived in March, through the territorial investigation that Reed's referral had initiated. Not all of it. There was a calculation about the contractor's liability that reduced the final amount, but most of it, and the formality of the process established something that hadn't existed before, a record. An acknowledgement that the people in the South Camp had been owed something and had been deliberately withheld from it. It wasn't justice in the comprehensive sense. It was a beginning of an account being kept. Wren, the young man with the broken arm, came to the ranch once before the railway workers' camp moved on. His arm was healed. He stood in the yard with the careful formality of someone who had decided to say something and was going to say it properly. Told Nadia, in the deliberate English he used when he chose to use it, that he had told his uncle in San Francisco about what had happened at the South Site and what she had done there, and that his uncle, who was a merchant and knew many people, had said that the story of a woman who used their language to help people who had nothing to offer her was worth telling. "I don't know if that matters," Wren said. "It matters," she said. "Stories go places we can't." He nodded. He shook her hand, a formal, serious shake, the kind of handshake that means something, and he left with the camp when it moved north in May. Elias asked her to marry him on a Tuesday morning in April, in the barn, while she was working on Cora's shoulder, and he was supposed to be doing something entirely different in the east pasture. She heard him come in and ignored it in the way she'd learned to manage his unannounced appearances. Then the silence had a particular quality to it, and she straightened up and turned around. He was not on one knee. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets, and his expression doing the thing it did when he was being more serious than he had words for. He said it plainly, would she marry him? She looked at him. The girls, she said, are mine, he said, if you'll have that. She thought about the day he'd held Mira in the kitchen because she was crying and Mei Lin was outside, and the way he'd said she was making a sound, as if he needed to explain the obvious. She thought about the way he'd ridden hard to Doc Boone's office when Fitch arrived with his folder. She thought about what he'd said in the paddock that November afternoon. I don't like not saying things that are true. She thought about the fact that he was an imperfect man, impatient sometimes, too compressed in the way he communicated, not good at asking for help, prone to carrying things alone for longer than was reasonable, and that she was an imperfect woman, sharp-edged in ways that didn't always serve her, stubborn past the point where stubbornness was a virtue, carrying things from Krakow and the ship and the train platform that she'd probably carry for a long time yet. Two imperfect people on a working ranch, with two daughters who had opinions about the world. It was not the life she'd imagined when she read the letter in a textile mill in Krakow and started to believe that answering it might be how the next chapter of her life began. But she had learned, over the months in Kansas, that the life you imagine and the life that turns out to be yours are almost never the same thing, and that the gap between them is not where you failed, it's where you actually lived. Yes, she said. He didn't move immediately. He was the kind of man who needed a moment with things after they happened. And she understood this, and she went back to Cora's shoulder while he found his way to whatever came after the asking. After a moment, he came to stand beside her at the stall, and they were quiet together in the barn the way they'd been quiet together in the barn on 100 mornings. I'll write to the county clerk today, he said. Cord's going to be insufferable about it, she said. Cord already knows, Elias said. He's been insufferable since November. She looked at him. He saw it before I admitted it, Elias said without apparent embarrassment. He's a perceptive young man. She laughed. It was a real laugh, not the polite kind, the kind that came from somewhere genuine, and surprised her with how good it felt. They were married at the ranch in May, on a Saturday when the South Garden was starting to show what it intended to become. It was not an elaborate event. Mrs. Okafor came. Boone came. Henrik and Mrs. Hoffman came with their daughter-in-law. Dix came and was quiet about it, in the way he was quiet about most things that moved him. Mei Lin wore a dress that Nadia had not seen before and had clearly been kept for occasions, and she stood beside Nadia during the ceremony, in a way that meant something Nadia didn't have a single word for in any of the languages she spoke. Lena attended by grabbing everything within reach. Mira attended by standing. She had figured out independent standing the previous week, and was applying it to every surface in her vicinity with quiet, determined pride. The ceremony was simple. The judge who performed it was a circuit man who came through the county every 3 months, not Reed, who was 12 miles north and not on the circuit. He read the words that needed to be read. Elias said what needed to be said. Nadia said what needed to be said, in her accented English, on the land she was going to keep. The train platform in Red Hollow was rebuilt in the summer of 1878. The old one had gotten soft in the middle boards, and the railway company sent a crew and the town contributed labor, and by August it was a new thing, same location, different boards. There was a small gathering when they finished it, not an official ceremony, just the way people collect around something completed in a town where completed things were worth noting. Nadia was there because she'd come into town for supplies, and the timing happened. She stood at the edge of the platform's new boards and thought about what it had been 2 years before, in October. She thought about the money scattered across the old boards and the wind taking some of it off the edge. Thought about the boy with the broom who had told her about the blue door, and who she now knew was named James and was 14 and had, apparently, been watching the entire scene with a 12-year-old's absolute, unsentimental clarity. She thought about what she'd been on that platform, frightened, in a way she hadn't let herself name at the time, with 2 babies and 1 suitcase, and the beginning of understanding that the life she'd crossed an ocean for was not going to happen, and that she was going to have to make something different out of whatever was in front of her. What she had made was not what she'd planned. It was more in some ways, and harder in most, and she would not trade it for the version she'd imagined, which said something she was still in the process of understanding. She had not changed her voice. Not for Edgar Caldwell. Not for the hotel with the help wanted sign that was already filled. Not for the courthouse or the county inspector or the lawyer asking whether a woman of her background might have misunderstood. She had kept her accent and her Polish and her way of speaking to horses in words that were not English, and she had found that those things, the things she'd been told, were the problem, were also the things that had made her useful in a crisis, that had made her someone Way would tell things to, that had made Wren look at her after the chaos of the South site with an almost smile and say, "Neither are you." There was something in that worth holding, not as a lesson delivered cleanly, with a beginning and an ending and a clear moral. That was not how it had worked. It had worked in the messy, incremental way that things actually work through 100 decisions made in conditions of incomplete information, through relationships built over time, through friction and proximity, and accumulated small moments of choosing to stay rather than go. She had not been brave in a straightforward way. She had been stubborn in a way that looked like bravery from the outside, and she had been afraid in a way she managed to keep interior, and she had made mistakes and miscalculated things and been sustained, more than pride usually allowed her to admit, by people who had given her things she hadn't earned yet when she needed them. Mei Lin's willow bark tea at 2 a.m. Mrs. Okafor's blue door and her direct questions. Dick's at the fence line at 7. Cord coming to her instead of Elias, because somewhere in the course of things he'd decided she was the one who needed to know. Boone saying quietly that he'd had trained assistants who'd managed less. Wren's formal handshake, even Peter's, standing at the yard gate with his hat in his hands, unable to carry the thing any further. She had not saved herself. She had been the person capable of receiving what others were willing to give, and that was not a lesser thing. It was possibly the harder thing to remain someone that help could reach, when the instinct was to close up and make yourself unassailable. A woman carrying a small child came down the platform steps and stopped near the bottom, looking around with the particular expression of someone who has just arrived somewhere and is trying to get their bearings. She was speaking to the child in a language Nadia couldn't immediately place something Eastern European, not Polish. Her clothing was practical but worn. She had one bag. Nadia looked at her for a moment. Then she went over. "The town is this direction," she said, pointing. "The boarding house with the blue door misses. Okafor's is 2 blocks north, and then left at the harness shop. She's a fair woman." She paused. "If you need work or don't know where to start, you can come to the Mercer Ranch, 3 miles east. We take people on." The woman looked at her with the wariness of someone who had learned not to accept things from strangers at face value. Nadia understood that look perfectly. "Your accent," the woman said carefully. "You're not from here." "No," Nadia said. "I arrived here 2 years ago on this platform with 2 babies and 1 suitcase and nowhere to go." The woman looked at her. She looked at the town behind her, the main street with its stores and its politics and its complicated social arithmetic. "Got better," she said. "It got true," Nadia said, "which is different and harder and more worth having." The woman seemed to turn this over. Then she adjusted her bag on her shoulder and looked at the town with something that was not quite hope and was not quite fear, something more practical than either. "Blue door," she said. "Blue door," Nadia confirmed. "Can't miss it." She watched the woman walk toward town, and she stood on the rebuilt platform boards in the Kansas summer, and she thought about the voice her aunt had said carried everything she'd survived: the Polish vowels, the animal calming low notes, the careful English built word by word over months of necessity. She had not changed it. She had let it carry what it was made to carry. And it had turned out, in the end, that was enough, not because the world had finally decided to accept her, but because she had never, not for a single day, decided to become easier to dismiss. That was the thing she knew now, standing where she'd once stood with money scattered around her feet and 2 crying babies and a door shutting in her face. You don't change your voice to make them comfortable. You let it take you where it's meant to take you, and then you hold the door open for whoever comes next.